on this case. Again, they are trying to assess the situation, and we still have an active situation where they're checking to see if there might be a second shooter.
Pierre, stand by. We'll come back to you shortly. Aaron Katersky with ABC News has also been on the scene along with our entire team this morning. Diane Sawyer on the way for World News this evening. And Aaron, I was taking note of one of the emails that you sent out earlier that as recently as about an hour ago, they were still searching car to car.
It was really interesting, David, to see police officers in tactical gear with assault rifles drawn, going business to business, house to house, car to car, looking for any evidence of another shooter. We know that one of the suspected gunmen is dead. There were reports of another, and police officers were conducting these searches, in many cases, David, with children who had evacuated from the school just 20 to 30 yards away, as parents have come to a local firehouse to collect their children. As they passed by to leave the scene, they saw these tactically clad officers with their guns drawn going through this search, and one father put his arm around his son's eyes to shield him from this sight.
It's going to be difficult for these parents to not only explain what happened, but the people in this tactical gear that they witnessed as the children were being taken from the school. Have you been able to talk with any of the parents, and how are the children doing? We've seen some of the images of these teachers who have been simply heroic today in taking these children out of the school so carefully as they have.
David, at first word of the shooting, which happened just before 10 a.m. Eastern Time, so the school day was fully underway, the students were told to grab a buddy and get out, and they did it very quickly. They were told to not run, but walk very quickly, grabbing the hand of a buddy, and walk to the nearby firehouse, and they did it without grabbing any of their belongings. We saw many of the children bundled up in their parents' coats because they didn't have time to grab their own jacket. And when we talked to many of the parents, David, as you could imagine, they said that the worst went through their head as a reverse 911 alert system informed parents to come here to the firehouse to collect their children. One woman said she had no idea what to think. She was fully prepared for the worst. One father said he had never been more panicked than on that drive from work to this firehouse to come get his son.
Sadly, as you know, when parents get calls like these, or whenever there's a headline like this one that flashes up, people fear the worst, and it would appear as these numbers unfold today, if you're just tuning in, this is ABC News live coverage of a simply horrific shooting today in Newtown, Connecticut. It's about 60 miles northeast of New York City, where today a gunman, we believe at least one gunman, shot and killed himself, but not until he had exacted horrific terror inside this elementary school today, killing at least 27 people, at least 27. The number continues to grow throughout the morning, and many of the victims are believed to in fact be children at that elementary school. As you heard Aaron Katersky report just moments ago, the children were brought out. They'd been told to grab a friend, to leave all their belongings aside, and I can tell you in this part of the country, it's a cold day, temperatures in the 40s. You can see they don't have their coats on. Parents were alerted to go into a nearby firehouse, the Sandy Hook Volunteer Firehouse. That's where ABC's Dan Harris has been standing by this morning. And Dan, these reunions with parents have got to be something to witness.
They are. We've been watching a steady stream of families emerging from this firehouse, and everybody is truly distraught and shaken. I had a conversation with one mother who had an 8-year-old in the school. I talked with the mother and her 8-year-old, and she said, you just don't expect it to happen in a place like this. Now, you hear that all the time, of course, as you know, David, having covered events like this, but I got to tell you, this is a truly unique situation in that this is a very small town in a rural area, a beautiful, bucolic southern New England town, not at all what you would expect to see all of these police officers here and to have all of this mayhem carried out in this environment is truly unusual. I talked to this 8-year-old girl who was evacuated from the school. She said he was very calm, but the students were distraught and scared. There was a lot of crying and screaming, she said. Not much screaming, but a lot of crying. She said that she didn't hear any gunshots, but that she heard the ambulances and that she was very scared, but the other students, she said, were even more scared. And let me tell you about one other conversation I had, David, just a moment ago with a parent who arrived here at the volunteer firehouse. She did not have students in this school. She has students in another school nearby. She was just coming to check on her friends who have students here. She said she was waiting to go pick up her children for 2 more hours because she said these are the last 2 remaining hours of their childhood, because once they learn what happened here, their innocence will most certainly be lost.
We cannot underscore that being the case. The kinds of conversations that will play out not only in households for the community that this is taking place in, but across America as this headline continues to worsen as the morning turns to afternoon here. At least 27 shot. That's Dan Harris reporting from the Sandy Hook Firehouse. And Dan, I'm struck by the fact that these children were at their school desks. The school day was well underway, that they were in these classrooms with their teachers, and they'd been asked to simply get up and walk out. And as you describe the tears, not the screaming, but the tears, it would seem that these children, although it's elementary school, certainly knew the heaviness of the situation that they were enduring.
They knew that something bad had happened. They absolutely knew that. I don't know if they knew or if they even know now, David, at this late date, relatively speaking. I don't know if they know yet the gravity of this situation. It is really just trickling out, the seriousness of the crime committed inside that school. So it remains to be seen how that information will be relayed to them. You said it. It's these conversations, these difficult conversations that parents are now going to have with these children about what happened inside this school. Unimaginably hard conversations. And then, of course, there are the parents who are not able to pick up their children right now, David. The parents who are going to be getting the worst of all possible news updates, that their children were, in fact, lost inside that school. And that drama is unfolding as we speak in this bucolic little town in southern New England.
Yeah, painful hours ahead for those parents who are waiting and hoping that they're not one of the parents who are informed. And of course, there'll be hugs across this country as children come home from school elsewhere. Dan, stick with us because that's obviously a very important vantage point you have. The firehouse where the children were brought, where parents were told to come and reunite with their children. And Dan, as you mentioned, parents describing the scene, appreciating what these teachers pulled off this morning. And Diane Sawyer, who of course is on her way to the scene, did get a chance to talk with some parents a short time ago as we were on the air covering this breaking story. And I wanted to give viewers who are just tuning in a little bit of the color, the parents describing this scene as it unfolded there in Newtown, Connecticut.
We got a phone call just that there had been a report of a shooting and that all schools were in lockdown, and it didn't say what school. Then a neighbor said that they heard that it was Sandy Hook, which is where our children go, and we immediately jumped in the car and headed here. There's a parent I know who happened to be in the building at the time, and she's pretty broken up. She was in a meeting with the principal and some other people, and they heard shooting. They got up, they went out, and she had stayed in the conference room, and my understanding from her is the principal and other people got shot when they went out into the hallway, and she was the one who called 911.
I worked so close that I saw the first cop cars rolling down there, so I just literally ran down there, and I got pretty much up to the school with a bunch of other parents that were right on the scene. And as they were leading the kids out, single file, and I saw him right away and just went with him at that point.
And how shaken was Edwin? What did he want to talk to you about?
He does not really want to talk about it. He's just scared and shaken. He told us that he didn't see, he heard, and that his friends and teacher are all okay. And so right now we're just focused on comforting him.
I heard that children were taken out bloody. Several teachers and mother who was actually in the school said that a masked man came in and started firing.
My wife and I drove right over there, and when we arrived, I would say there was probably about 40 parents there or so, and they were just gathering children at the firehouse. It did become a very chaotic situation, obviously, because everyone was trying to get their children out. But like I said, between the police and the fire department personnel that were there, and especially the school teachers, I am just so proud of the way that our town has responded to this.
So proud of the way that the town has responded to this, from that father right there who echoed what other parents said, which is that they will be hugging their children, the children who did get out alive. You heard the one mother there describing what she had heard, that reports of a masked man who entered the school and started firing. There were reports from one parent there that some of the children were actually brought out from the school bloody. And this, as we look at the number on your screen, and it's a harrowing one, at least 27 shot at this school in Connecticut, Newtown, Connecticut. It is the Sandy Hook Elementary School, a small, close-knit community. We do know that a number of those victims, perhaps the majority of them, could be children. And of course, we'll learn more as this horrific story unfolds. You're looking at pictures right now, parents holding onto their children's hands, this mother carrying her daughter past the fire trucks, authorities responding to the scene immediately after those initial calls came in. And as is the case with any of these emergencies, in the beginning you start to hear a trickle of information and you fear that it could be really bad, but you're hoping that it's not, and that's what you continue to hear from parents here. And what has unfolded is in fact a horrible picture, a tragedy in this small town, and the numbers continue to grow. We are waiting a news conference a short time from now. It will be a first time hearing from authorities in that community. We do know that the FBI is on the scene, that Connecticut State Police are also on the scene. But as you know, as we look at helicopter shots from our affiliate WABC television here in New York, that security at elementary schools nationwide is extraordinarily basic. Armed guards, very rare at schools. One security consultant telling us that this shooting is unprecedented at an elementary school. It's history-making for all the wrong reasons. We have, to the best of our recollection, never reported on a mass shooting of this scope at an elementary school here in America. I know from picking up, my little niece at an elementary school that you sign in a clipboard when you go in at the front of the school, and then you pick up the child, and that's often the case at schools around the country. It's just almost an impossible feat to think that these schools would be any more secure than they are already. We do know that these events can happen, and that's why teachers and administrators are drilled on this. And it sounds as though their practice, their training played out today when you hear about how calmly they took those children from the school, and that one father who said he was, and the word he used, was proud of the way that school and his community was reacting to this morning. Our senior justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, working his sources in Washington. And Pierre, what can you tell us about the latest in the investigation?
Again, the FBI and ATF and federal sources are trying to give all the support they can to the local police. Again, right now the concern is about the children. As you said, at least 27 people killed in this horrific incident, mostly children, we're told. The FBI, we're also being told, has been in communication with the governor and state officials. Also, we're being told that the President of the United States has been briefed about this very tragic affair.
Our Jake Tapper at the White House did report that the president was briefed some time ago by FBI Director Bob Mueller. He's spoken to Connecticut Governor Malloy, Dan Malloy, who was previously the mayor of Stamford, now the governor there in Connecticut. And we do believe that he's on his way to the scene, if not having arrived already. For those of you just tuning in now, we continue to follow a school shooting here, 1:29 in the afternoon. We've been following it since this morning, and the numbers have simply been breathtaking. At least 27 shot and killed, many of them children. Authorities on the scene. We're awaiting the first press conference to get a clearer picture. We do know that there was at least one gunman involved. It's believed this gunman then took their own life. And we heard a mother who joined us earlier in our breaking news coverage tell us that the children were brought out, many of them injured, bloodied, that there was a masked man who had entered the school, a masked man, and began shooting. The parents who did find their children at a neighboring volunteer firehouse, the Sandy Hook firehouse, holding them, hugging their children. And you can simply imagine, for the parents in this community, trying to find out if their children are in fact on the outside, or if they were perhaps in one of the rooms where this dramatic and very sad tragedy unfolded here this morning. There's no word, as you heard there from Pierre Thomas in his reporting, about who this gunman is, what the motive could have been for something like this. There's never any explanation for something like this, but we do usually get a window into the person who could commit such a heinous act, and that will certainly follow. What will also follow is the conversations that will not only play out in this community, but across America tonight, when parents whose children simply get a flash of this, and as I said as we came on the air today, if you have children in the house, this is our special report coverage of a shooting in Connecticut, and for obvious reasons you might want to ask them to leave the room or give them something else to do as we follow these unfolding developments. ABC News anchor Dan Harris has been at the Sandy Hook Volunteer Firehouse this morning. He arrived a short time ago, and Dan, that was the spot where parents were alerted, were told to go, and I can only imagine the drive to get to that firehouse to find out if one of their children was at the firehouse waiting for a hug, waiting to be taken home.
Oh, yeah. I mean, just frantic. And I'm just so struck standing here, David, watching this steady stream of families filing out of this firehouse with the looks on their faces just tell the whole story. People are tearful, their faces are drawn and pale. This is something that nobody could ever predict, least of all here. You know, speaking to a parent earlier, she said, I need to sort of pinch myself to wake up and realize that this is happening here. It doesn't feel real. It feels like a dream, and a very bad one, a nightmare, in fact, was the term she used. People are absolutely in shock at the depth and breadth of the horror here, but also that it took place here is what is the source of so much surprise. But again, David, I just am so struck by watching these families walk out of this firehouse. A lot of hugging going on here, even among first responders who you would imagine would have a certain amount of scar tissue, having seen what they see every day on their job. You're seeing people here truly shocked, even people who are used to seeing very difficult scenes.
Dan Harris reporting from the firehouse, the volunteer firehouse, which is right around the corner from the Sandy Hook Elementary School. There are about 500 students who go to school there, so you can simply imagine the task underway after the first reports of this. The teachers in that school, the school day had begun. Children were in classrooms sitting at their desks when they got the word from their teachers to grab a pal, grab a buddy in the classroom and leave. We saw some images of them leaving in single file lines behind their teachers. As Dan Harris reported earlier, tears. You could hear the crying of the children as they left the school, but remarkably, he said there was no screaming, which just indicates how carefully these teachers carried this out this afternoon, and really what a fine job they did under such extraordinary circumstances. I can tell you that we're getting breaking developments on the investigative side of this. Chris Cuomo, who is on the scene, is now reporting, and this has been confirmed, that one of the shooters was 24 years old. And this is a new development. We've been reporting all morning that we knew of at least one shooter who then took their own life. What we did not know was whether or not there was, in fact, more than one shooter. And it's believed right now that state police are confirming to ABC News that two shooters were initially believed involved in this mass shooting. One of those shooters taking their own life after this horrific scene. It would also help to explain, as Aaron Kotursky reported earlier, why police, as recently as an hour ago, armed in tactical gear, were continuing to go car to car surrounding that school. You can see the aerial shots showing the chaos, the parking lots surrounding those schools. They went from car to car looking for evidence, and it's now believed they were also looking for a possible second gunman. State police confirming that it's believed two shooters were initially believed to be involved in this mass shooting. They are right now looking for an additional shooter, according to sources as they report this to ABC News. I want to bring back in Pierre Thomas. And Pierre, we have unfortunately reported on scenes like this before when there was more than one gunman who entered one of these schools. And to help our viewers put this in perspective, Columbine High School, 1999, as we know, there were two shooters, 13 people killed, 24 injured. And just to put this into context, 13 killed in Columbine. It was horrific then, it is horrific today, and the number right now as it stands, at least 27 shot and killed, and many of those victims we know are children, Pierre.
No one has seen anything quite like this, David. And again, you talk to federal sources, and they've been involved in all kinds of cases. And this is as depressed as they've sounded since 9/11, quite frankly. The notion of the children being involved, they're deeply saddened about it. They're committed to trying to give whatever support they can give to the state and local officials. But again, just devastating.
Devastating to learn the developments here, too, that there were possibly two gunmen, that one taking their own life afterwards. And it's believed the 24-year-old gunman, as this suspect is described, was armed with 4 weapons, was wearing a bulletproof vest. We know that's the description coming from sources telling ABC News' Chris Cuomo, that one of the shooters, 24, carrying several weapons, 4 in fact, and wearing that bulletproof vest. I simply do not know if that's the same person described by the mother that you heard earlier on air, describing The gunman is a masked man who entered the school and began firing. Several parents simply saying they got word quickly. And as Dan was saying, this is a very small town, a very tight-knit community, so you can imagine how quickly word spread. As these parents described going to the scene, hoping that they would find their loved ones. But now, as this afternoon unfolds, the question will be, how much higher could this number go? And how will they begin to notify these parents of the children who did not make it out? More than 24 victims in this shooting. It's believed to be the worst shooting at an elementary school in America in history. That's our belief at this point. We continue to look back across our reporting of incidents like this one. They are all horrific, and often what emerges are scenes of great heroism, and in this case, just the images of the teachers. We know that they will be applauded for their efforts. The father who said he's proud of the way they handled it today. WABC speaking to a young boy about what he saw, and it's believed that we have some of that audio now. Let's take a listen.
There's a man pinned down to the ground with handcuffs on, and we thought that was the victim. We really didn't get a good glance at him because he was, like, there's a car blocking it, plus we were running really quick. So then we got to the firehouse and we sat in our classes, and we were all really happy that we're all alive.
Happy that we're all alive. Powerful words from the little boy with the trademark buzz cut, getting out of elementary school okay. He talked about that firehouse that we're going to hear a lot about, the Sandy Hook Volunteer Firehouse that's right around the corner from the school, where students were told simply to grab a friend and get to the firehouse. They walked out of the school on what you can see is a sunny day here in the Northeast, temperatures in the low 40s. They did not have their coats on, and that would explain why later in the day so many of these children were sort of huddled with their parents, wrapped in their parents' coats after their parents arrived. A familiar scene also seeing many of these parents with cell phones. There was one mother with her cell phone I saw a short time ago. You can only imagine, probably calling dad to say their child is okay. That little boy saying, got a quick shot, a quick view of someone, but that they did not know at the time whether that was the someone causing such horror in their school. It's believed at this hour, and it's been confirmed to ABC News by state police there in Connecticut, that 2 shooters were initially believed involved in the mass shooting. One of those shooters now dead. What's not been confirmed is whether or not that gunman took his own life or whether or not there was something that ensued after authorities began arriving at the scene. And now the big question will be, is there in fact that second shooter, and where is that second shooter? There have been searches that have unfolded throughout the afternoon, car to car, with authorities there armed. As you can see, they're heavily armed, many of them carrying their automatic weapons to try to find out really what unfolded here today. Can you imagine being a parent of a little child who saw this scene that you're looking at right now? Just teams of authorities coming in holding guns. It's the kind of thing that you typically see in a television drama. And now these children will be asking their parents about the reality of what unfolded there at their elementary school today. Pierre, these reports that are coming in about a possible second shooter, that would explain why we were seeing authorities continue their search right up until minutes ago.
Absolutely, David. In situations like this, you have sometimes conflicting information from eyewitnesses, and until you know for certain, you're going to check every car, every house, everything around that school until you know for certain what this is.
Pierre, we'll check back in with you. Let's go to the news conference, our first time hearing from authorities.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roy Occhio Grosso. I'll spell the last name. It's OCCHIOGROSSO. I work for Governor Malloy. As you can imagine, the governor is horrified by what's happened. He is meeting with the families right now. His chief concern is to get the families the information they need as quickly as possible. That's why he's not here. I'm going to introduce Lieutenant Paul Vance from the State Police, who will talk a little bit about what's known so far. We understand that you are all interested in information. We'd like to get you that information as quickly as possible, but the governor's chief concern is making sure that the families have information as quickly as possible, and that's where he is now. This is Lieutenant Paul Vance from the State Police.
Hi, good afternoon. I will give you some very basic and brief information as we know it now, and we will set up regular press briefings as appropriate. Just after 9:30 this morning, Newtown Police received a 911 call for an emergency at the elementary school. Newtown PD, upon obtaining information as to the stature of the situation, contacted the Connecticut State Police and requested assistance from state police and surrounding local police departments. On and off duty troopers responded to the school, and with Newtown Police, immediately upon arrival, entered the school and began a complete active shooter search of the building. That included checking every door, every crack, every crevice, every portion of that school. Our main objective was to evacuate as quickly and efficiently as possible any and all students and faculty in the school. The entire school was searched. That was accomplished. A staging area was set up. The students and staff were put into that staging area, and soon thereafter, the children and staff were reunited with their parents and their loved ones. There were several fatalities at the scene, both students and staff. There is no information relative to that that is being released at this time until we've made complete and proper notification. The shooter is deceased inside the building. There's a great deal of work that is undertaken immediately upon locating the shooter, and that is there's a great deal of search warrant activity, there's a great deal of law enforcement activity both in and out of state to ensure that we cover all the bases relative to that specific individual. Suffice it to say, the scene is secure. State Police Major Crime Squad, Newtown Police Department, Danbury State's Attorney, and many agencies are working together to answer all the questions surrounding exactly what happened. As Mr. Ochoa-Grosso said, we will keep you briefed, we will keep you informed on a regular basis. We will put everything out via our website and with these press conferences. I'll turn it back over to Mr. Ochoa-Grosso right now.
The governor took a call from President Obama a little while ago, who was calling to express his condolences and condolences on behalf of the nation, and pledged whatever resources the federal government can bring to bear to assist the families and to assist in the investigation. We will get you information as soon as we can get the families the information. That's where the governor is. At some point later today, the governor will be here, and we will set up regular briefings. Thank you.
Are all those briefings going to be?
That is the first briefing from authorities at the scene there in Newtown, Connecticut, at the school where this morning 27 people were shot and killed, at least 27 that we know of at this point. Sandy Hook Elementary School, about 500 students there. And as you heard, the governor there has arrived, the governor of Connecticut, Dan Malloy. He is right now briefing parents at the scene, which is why we didn't see him in front of the microphone there. That was a spokesman for the governor saying he did receive a call from President Obama, who also was briefed this morning and continues to be briefed throughout the day here on the scope of this tragedy, the worst shooting at an elementary school in American history, it's believed. Lieutenant Paul Dance with the Connecticut State Police there speaking a moment ago, and I was struck by what he said. Every door, every crack, every crevice inside that school has been searched. The entire school searched, now secured, he said. He did deliver the news, several fatalities at the scene, and he said this number, at least 27, includes students and staff at the school. He said the shooter was deceased inside the building. He did not mention more than one shooter. As we reported earlier, Chris Cuomo has been told by sources that at least initially it was believed there could be two shooters, which would explain the searching outside the school. But as the fog clears on this horrible tragedy, we'll know later in the day just how many people were involved with this. But at this point, Lieutenant Paul Dance, Connecticut State Police, reporting moments ago that a shooter is deceased inside the building, that the fatalities do include students and staff, and it's believed our Dan Harris, who was at the firehouse, now at the scene. And Dan, we've just been told the governor is briefing parents as we speak. That governor, Dan Malloy, has heard from the president earlier today, condolences from Washington on what is simply a horrific scene playing out in Newtown, Connecticut today.
Horrific is just one of many words to describe this, David. Let me give you a sense of where we are. Right behind me is a volunteer firehouse, and just up over the hill that way is the school, Sandy Hook Elementary. This volunteer firehouse is where all the children from that school were brought in the moments after the shooting broke out. This is where parents were told to come pick up their children, and we've been here for some time now, really just watching a steady stream of poignant scenes, parents coming to pick up their children, leaving with looks on their faces that really tell the whole story. They are crestfallen. Their faces are gaunt and drawn and pale. There are a lot of tears, a lot of trying to shield the children from the eyes of the media gathered here. I talked to one mother who was leaving with her 8-year-old. The 8-year-old told me that when the shooting broke out inside the school, there was a lot of crying, some screaming, but generally relatively calm. The kids were told to leave the school immediately and come here to the firehouse. Spoke to the mother as well. She said she felt like she needed to pinch herself because of the unreality of this. It is so incongruous to be having this type of event playing out against this backdrop, David. I can't establish firmly enough for you how beautiful and rural a town this is. Just a scenic southern New England town, very small. Fewer than 30,000 people live here. We're in a neighborhood called Sandy Hook, named after a bend in the river here. It's a particularly rural part of this otherwise very rural town. Not a place where you ever expect something like this to take place, and people really have a lot to come to terms with here in Sandy Hook.
I can tell you, Dan, for so many parents, and I know when I go home, I often try to go pick up my nieces or nephew at school. That's one of the great parts of the day that plays out in this country, is the moment you go to pick up your children, and there's a smile waiting for you on the other side. And the fact that picking up your children today at this particular elementary school has taken on such profound meaning for parents who got the call, the alert to go to that firehouse. And not know whether or not their children was one of the children who actually got out. Dan, maybe you could help us with this. The governor is believed to be briefing the parents. I don't know what that briefing would entail, and likely you don't either, but there are certainly a lot of people in that community who are waiting and hoping that they don't see their name on that list.
Absolutely. I mean, you gotta keep in mind, at least according to the latest numbers we have right now, David, there are more than 20 families in this tiny neighborhood here who are unsure where their children are and who are at some point during the course of this day going to get some astonishingly bad news, given the latest numbers we have about the number of fatalities here. So we've got a governor who swooped into town to try to deal with some of this, but the notification process is going to be grisly. And just to amplify something you were talking about before, about the process of picking kids up for school, how it's a daily joy for so many parents across this country, and how it was so loaded, urgent, and frantic here today. Just speaking to this parent who I was talking to a short while ago as soon as I pulled up on the scene, and having her tell me about the course of her day, which started with this reverse 911 text message that showed up on her phone saying there'd been a shooting at a school, didn't say which one, that parents needed to go pick up their children as soon as possible. She called her husband. Her husband said, get in the car and go to the school immediately. She got here. She saw her husband holding their 8-year-old daughter, who was crying hysterically. The daughter was fine. So were all of her classmates. And it was so interesting to hear, to watch the body language between this mother and her 8-year-old. The mother just couldn't take her hands off her child. She was so relieved that her child was safe, something that she took for granted as early as an hour before, the safety of her child. Now, she could no longer take for granted. And let me just tell you about one other quick exchange I had with a parent a short while ago. I mentioned this to you earlier, but it bears repeating. I saw a truly frantic, very anxious woman showing up on the scene here a while ago. She said she didn't have any children in the Sandy Hook Elementary School, but she had friends who did, and she was coming here to check on them. She also told me that she had children in another school nearby, but she was waiting for a few hours to pick them up. And here's why, David. She said these are the last 2 hours of their childhood. Once they hear what happened here today, their innocence will truly be lost. And you get a sense of the lost innocence when you watch people filing out of this fire station behind me, David, many of them carrying stuffed animals. It really tells you about the kind of victim we're dealing with in this massacre today.
Stuffed animals and wrapped in their parents' coats. There was an image, Dan, as you were reporting moments ago, a firefighter on the scene, and what I would presume to be a parent holding their child, and the firefighter wrapping what looked to be a blanket around the child. These children, for those of you just tuning in, this is ABC News coverage of a shooting at a Connecticut elementary school in Newtown, Connecticut. It's The numbers are just simply staggering. At least 27 shot and killed, many of them children. And as I was going to say, these children inside the school, were told at a moment's notice to simply grab a friend and make your way for the door. And the images of the children listening to that call from their teachers and leaving the school single file. Our reporters on the scene telling us they could hear cries, the whimpers from the children, but that there was not screaming, that it was remarkably quiet as this exit from the building, this mass evacuation of this elementary school, where it's believed there are about 500 students who go to school at the Sandy Hook Elementary School every day. The president being briefed on this morning, and in thinking about the president, a father himself, he has often talked, obviously, about his own two daughters and how they shape his own view as president. And just moments ago, we heard from White House spokesman Jay Carney, who said, as a father, incidents like these weigh heavily on the president. The president has been briefed throughout the morning, and so I want to bring in our senior justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, who can give me an idea of how those briefings unfold and who it is the president's been in touch with. We do know he did talk with the governor of Connecticut a short time ago, sending his condolences and an offer of help with anything else this community will need. We'll check back in with Pierre Thomas in our Washington bureau. In the bureau, I believe he's with us. Pierre, can you hear us?
Yeah, now I can hear you. Go ahead, David.
Fantastic. I know that you continue to watch these pictures with me, and I was just talking about Jay Carney at the White House spokesman, who talked about, the weight the president carries as a father himself, often talking about his own two girls who are in school themselves. He's offered help to this community, his condolences to the governor, Dan Malloy, who at this hour is briefing the parents on the scene. As we heard Dan Harris say, there are so many families gathered there who simply do not know and are fearing the worst without their children coming out of this school. What can you tell me about the president's circle at this point? Who's been briefing him?
Well, we understand that the FBI director has briefed the president. Also, Homeland Security officials are engaged in this process. Also, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Basically, the federal government, in a case like this, steps up to the local and law enforcement people and say, what do you need? And they've been getting information and passing it up the food chain to the president to let him know the scale of this. Typically, if it weren't a scale this large, the president would not be briefed. But given the fact that so many dead, so many children involved, the president had to be briefed. It reminds me of the Virginia Tech shooting in the sense of when you have a classroom situation where people are in a room typically and backed in and often with nowhere to go if the shooter comes through a single door, which most classrooms involve, you can have these mass casualties. And if you recall in Virginia Tech, many people were shot and the shooter only had a handgun.
I remember that vividly, both you and I there reporting on the scene, Pierre, and that was one of the great tragedies of that particular shooting, and so many that we report on, that one single entrance as you describe, and it basically sums up what these classrooms are like for children and their teachers when something like this unfolds. And thankfully it's not often in this country, but because there is one doorway, there is really little room for these children and the teachers who are in those classrooms with them to escape when horror like this begins to unfold. We heard earlier in our coverage here from a little boy, you'll remember him with the little brush cut, talking about how he got out, how they saw someone that they didn't know at the time that was the particular gunman inside the school inflicting such horror. And he talked about how happy he was to see his friends and that his friends had made it out. Profound words from a child only in elementary school, and I believe we now have sound from his father as well.
It was terrifying. I'm still terrified. I think I'm still in shock about it all. I still don't know everything that happened. I know that there are some people missing, that they've been taken to the hospital. I don't know if everyone's been accounted for. It's terrifying. You're rushing over here and you can't get to where you need to go, and you have to park down here and walk. I'm glad that my son is okay. He seems to be handling it actually pretty good right now. I know my son's teachers have been okay as well, but I've heard other teachers are not okay.
Are there parents that don't know what's going on, that their kids are unaccounted for when you went to go pick them up?
There were a few. They actually found, I think they just found one. There was a big cheer that went up that they had found someone, and they just may have been not not at the firehouse, somewhere else.
The numbers are, it might be up to 18 kids and 27 people.
Painful to watch. The dad who simply put his hand to his mouth, and you can only imagine when the parents are able to get their heads around what unfolded here today, and the fact that some of them have been extraordinarily lucky to be able to find their little ones waiting for them when they got there. And now what we are waiting to unfold this afternoon is this excruciatingly difficult process of informing parents about the children who did not make it out. As we heard there a short time ago, Connecticut State Police confirming that there are many children among the dead, and there are staff members among the dead as well. The number still at least 27 shot and killed, and we'll continue to keep you updated on that number as we continue our coverage here on ABC News throughout the afternoon. I want to check in with one of our colleagues at WABC television here in New York and Connecticut, Newtown, Connecticut, just about 60 miles northeast of New York. So here in the Northeast, these communities are all beside one another. And in this particular town, a bucolic town, a picturesque town, so many of these families know one another intimately. And NJ Burkett is at the hospital. Danbury Hospital was on standby, I'm told, was designated a triage center for the incident early in the day. And NJ, perhaps you can describe the scene at this hour for us.
Well, David, as we arrived here in Danbury, we pulled up to the emergency room, and there were police officers with assault rifles outside the emergency room. The entire hospital complex is on lockdown. They say that's standard procedure. Certainly, given the circumstances, it is sadly understandable. The mood inside the hospital is really actually quite grim. We've heard scenes described to us of nurses breaking down in the corridors. People simply, as you put it, can't get their arms around the scope of the evil that's been perpetrated on this community. It is a scene that's going to play itself out, sadly, for the next several hours, the next several days, and who knows for how long. 3 people were taken to the hospital here, David. We cannot confirm the ages of those people. We cannot confirm their conditions. But a number of the people that I've spoken to here say they're heartbroken because they weren't able to treat more patients. Back to you.
Yeah, that is profound, NJ. I didn't know that until you brought that to us just moments ago. 3 people reportedly treated at Danbury Hospital, which had been designated the triage center for this incident when developments began unfolding here this morning, which would only leave us to believe that those people who were in the path of this gunman inside the school did not survive, that the number of people being treated would only be 3 at this hour. And as NJ reported there, describing the scenes inside the corridors of that hospital, we do know from Connecticut State Police that every inch of that school, as he said, every crack, every crevice was checked as they continued to search to try to secure the area. There had been questions about how many people might have been involved in this, and that's simply a question that will be outstanding until we can get further information from authorities. They did confirm for that community here as we continue our live coverage that the scene itself has been secured, even though up until about an hour and a half ago they were armed with their tactical gear in front of the children, going car to car in the parking lots you're seeing from these aerial shots from our partner station here in New York, WABC television, which has been on the scene from the moment they learned word of this. You can see some of the authorities approaching the scene. I'm not sure who it is you're looking at, though we do know the governor, Dan Malloy, is inside right now briefing parents, and that's got to be probably perhaps the most painful meeting so far of the day, are the parents who do not know whether or not their children made it out. And NJ, if you're still with us, I know you're at the hospital now, but you've been in that community for several hours now, and this is a tight-knit community. We can only imagine the fear for many of these families who have yet to reunite with their children.
Yeah, that's right, David. Tight-knit, middle-class, working-class community. You can't imagine what's going through people's hearts and their minds. I mean, even if you weren't directly involved, you're going to know somebody who was. You're going to feel for somebody who was. This is going to be a very, very painful place to be for a lot of people for a long time. Yes, the scene inside the hospital is one of abject grief. Nurses crying in the hallways, people inconsolable. And as I said before, inconsolable and heartbroken in some respects because they weren't able to treat more people, that they weren't able to do more for the children in that school, for the faculty and staff in the school. No question about it. Very, very painful, very difficult place to be. We are expecting a news conference here in the next hour or so, and hopefully we'll have details, and maybe we'll have some good news to bring you about the conditions of the 3 people who were brought here to the hospital. I'm at least hoping for that, David.
It would be welcomed on an afternoon when this is playing out in front of America. And it's now 2:02 in the afternoon. We're going to take a quick break and reset for the country, for many of the viewers now tuning in of the shooting that's playing out this morning. Shortly after 9:30, the first calls came in that there had been a shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. It's about 60 miles northeast of New York City for those of you who live here in the Northeast and in the rest of the country. It's not far. It takes about 45 minutes to get there from New York. We're told at this hour that there are at least 27 dead. The shooter, it's believed, was carrying 4 weapons, was 24 years old, was wearing a bulletproof vest, and as you can see there on the screen, entered the school, began firing, and then that shooter is deceased. We do not know, though authorities initially believe there might have been more than one shooter involved. We do not know if that is in fact the case and if they've located anyone else that might have been even tangentially connected to this crime today. We certainly don't know. Too early to say what could have been the motive for such a heinous crime. And to put this in perspective, what you're watching unfold today will be the deadliest shooting at an elementary school in American history. It's the second deadliest shooting behind Virginia Tech. As you'll remember, we all followed that story so closely. I remember being at Virginia Tech, and of course Columbine. There were 2 gunmen in Columbine, and there were more than a dozen shot and killed in that horrific shooting as well. But today the numbers are just simply staggering. At least 27 shot and killed, and many of the victims are children. I was struck by the description earlier, simply reminding us of what we all know when we take the kids to school or go on Meet the Teachers night, that schools are often made up of long hallways with classroom doors and proud teachers and their artwork hanging on the outside of that door. And unfortunately, that's the entrance to the classroom. So if you have a suspect who approaches that classroom door, as perhaps was the case today, there is just very little other than asking the children to perhaps dive under their desks. We do know that parents telling us earlier in our live coverage of this incident that the teachers were extraordinarily calm in taking these children out of the school. Some of them told the children to cover their eyes, but what they also told them was to grab a friend, leave all of your belongings behind. And this is the image that we keep coming back to this morning. Look at this. Their faces say it all. And if you've noticed, which I certainly did earlier, none of them have their coats on as they walk out of that school. And look at those adults in that frame, intent on getting those children to that neighboring firehouse there in Sandy Hook. There is a volunteer firehouse just adjacent to that school, and that is where teachers were told to take the children just as soon as they could. And perhaps in a sign of the times, a lot of these parents in the community got a reverse text alert on their cell phones. And initially it didn't even say the name of the school, is what my understanding is from the reporting here today. So you can only imagine, as parents were waiting to hear if it was in fact their school, but they received a reverse alert text is what it's called, the technology that alerts us if our children are in danger now in America, and they were told to go to that firehouse. But as we were talking about earlier, the security at schools in America is, as you know, it's almost impossible to lock up these elementary schools in America, or middle schools or high schools. It simply would be overwhelming to do. I know from my own experience, there's often when you walk in the front door, they'll guide you to the office and you have to sign in, and many schools have a pass, and there are hall monitors who sort of are there, sometimes security, to make sure that there's no one suspicious entering the school. But to have a school under lockdown in America is often discussed after incidents like these, but is simply almost an unattainable goal to have, and certainly not one that we want to have in America. Our students who are going to school in schools that are simply locked up. I'm just getting word from one of our other affiliates, WTNH, speaking to a 17-year-old boy who goes to Newtown Senior High School. He has a little sister in the 4th grade who attends the elementary school. They have since been reunited. It sounds as though they have been told that all of their relatives are out of the building, and so I wanted to take a listen here, and we'll talk here on the backside.
My whole life with my sister was just replaying through my head, and I was saying to myself, I'm sorry for whatever I did to you, and it was very, very traumatizing. I was very shaken.
So you had to calm yourself, your mom, try to find your sister?
I mean, truthfully, I had to be calmed by other people. Other people were coming up to me, they were hugging me. My mom was screaming her eyes out, she was...
And we're hearing all these reports that a number of students have lost their lives. What do you think about this? This is happening quite a bit lately.
It's a growing trend, and I feel like, there are certain leniencies in terms of the law, in terms of society, that are, in a way, permitting this to happen. And it's tragic.
Let me ask you this: we talked to a parent earlier. When you and your mom go to the school to pick up your sister at any given day, is it easy to get in and out of the school? Do they check your ID? Do they do anything?
They don't check ID, but there are regulations, and I'm not sure if that's a fair comparison, because this guy came in with a gun. It's not comparable to say, this children left with the school, when obviously a guy coming with a gun is, totally different.
So this is something completely unexpected for this area. It sounds like all the parents seem to know each other.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Literally the worst crime we have here is, we don't even have crime. The worst I've heard of here is like some thefts within cars. This is just mind-blowing. It's unbelievable.
So you're here right now because you want answers too. You're going to wait as long as it takes?
Absolutely. I was one of the first ones there. I want to know what's going on, and it's truly disgusting what's happening. But
Truly disgusting what's happening. That from a 17-year-old boy who was reunited with his little sister in the 4th grade. She was one of the many children, 500 school children believed to go to this elementary school, who many of them evacuated in single file lines today, clutching one another, and as their teachers, their valiant teachers, brought them to safety at that firehouse. Our thanks to reporter Aaron Logan and ABC station WTNH also joining our coverage on the ground there. I wanted to bring in our senior medical editor, Dr. Richard Besser, because I was struck by this, Rich, which is that the children leaving the school, there were reports of cries and tears, but no overt screaming, that they listened to their teachers, they were very calm. And it was the 17-year-old there a moment ago who said that he had to be calmed down by people on the scene, that his mother had to be calmed down. It's the adults in the situation, the older students who really know the scope of this. It's going to be extraordinary to sort of help them deal with it first, so that they can then help the younger members of their family who've survived this ordeal.
Yeah, David, I think you're right on track. How people react to this will depend a lot on their age, their level of development, and how much they're exposed to this. Very young children may not be able to comprehend this at all, and the best thing you can do for children who aren't in that area, children under 7, if you want to use a cutoff, is to not expose them to this. Don't let them hear the reports. Try not to let them see the coverage of this on television, because that repeated exposure and even hearing about this can be quite traumatic. You have to look at the age of the child, see how they're responding, and deal with them. Knowing your child is very, very important.
Knowing your child, very, very important. And I'm not sure if Rich is still with us. Rich, are you there?
Yeah, I am. When you look at those children who are school age, children who are 7 to teenage years, they're going to be looking to see how you respond to this. Are you able to express your anger and your sadness over this in a way that allows them to do the same? That's very important. Asking them how they're feeling is very important. But giving them the overall sense that this is a very bad thing that happened. Your job as a parent is to keep them safe, and that they are safe. That's what they're going to be looking for you, the cues from you on. The teenagers, you do want to engage in a conversation. You want to get a sense of why they think this happened, what could be done to prevent this from happening in the future, and try and engage them in a conversation so they can begin to process this as best they can.
So important indeed to reassure them, to check in with them, to see what they're thinking. And, you know, one of the things that we have continued to point out this morning, obviously, for people tuning in to our breaking news coverage really all afternoon here on this horrific shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, that if you have children in the room, and so many of you, I'm sure, have already sent them elsewhere in the home to go play, this is certainly not something they need to carry on their young shoulders as we learn more and more about what played out here in Newtown, Connecticut. And I want to bring in former FBI profiler Brad Garrett, an ABC News consultant. And Brad, we bring you in so often when tragedies like this play out. And right now, as it stands, Connecticut State Police confirming the shooter went inside. It's believed had 4 weapons, had a vest on. One mother said a mask. And as is always the case, we ask ourselves, what on earth would lead someone to do something like this?
Because this person has walked right up to the cliff of, I don't want to go on anymore. I've lost power. And it could be something like he had a child in the school. He's had a domestic dispute with a wife or an ex-wife. There's something that's driven this person right up to, I have lost complete control of my life and I don't care anymore. And David, as difficult as it is for people to understand this, this is how they empower themselves, whether it be a few days ago in Portland, Oregon, or Aurora, Colorado. They put on an outfit, which I'm going to call a costume, because that's what it is, because they're playing a different character. And they're going in there, and they don't view these children or the adults as human beings. They view them as the enemy, as people that have wronged them for whatever reason, and they're going to seek revenge. And unfortunately, this guy created tremendous, tremendous tragedy.
But how could someone look at children, and I know this is illness we're now diving into, but how can someone look at children, innocent children of this age, as being the enemy?
Because they don't look at it as a child. They look at it as they can take control of the situation and they can start killing people. And that's all they think about. I understand what you're saying. It's like it's one thing maybe to shoot a 30-year-old adult. It's another to shoot a 7-year-old. But they don't care. They have completely lost their touch, their empathy, their caring for anyone. And it's all about me. It's all about getting my feelings out and me taking control. And I realize that, again, sounds simplistic, but that's really all that's really goes on with these shooters. And I guess the other part of this is a little intriguing is you've got somebody older. David, most school shooters, as we both know, tend to be kids from the school, upset, angry, disturbed, they go back and shoot. This is an older person, so is he connected to the school? Does he have kids connected to the school? Was he wronged by somebody in the school? I don't know. And one of the things investigators are going to look at is there a bigger agenda here? Did he go there for another reason other than the obvious that you and I are talking about? Very, very important.
Well, Brad, as always is the case, you help us wrap our heads around something that's simply unfathomable. And stick with us here as our coverage continues on ABC News here. For those of you just joining us, this is the school shooting that began this morning with a call shortly after 9:30. And the fear was that this was going to be something big, and it has become just that. Historic, in fact, in nature. The worst shooting at an elementary school in this country ever. At least 27 shot and killed. We believe many of them are children. The shooter, at least one shooter, and the shooter inside the building, it's confirmed, is dead. And as we heard Brad there moments ago try to describe what can happen in someone's life that leads them to committing such a heinous act. I want to bring in NJ Burkett of our local station, WABC. And NJ, stick with me here because we just got word of the school security policy. And this is a letter that went out to all parents in that school district. Not long ago, in fact, they had updated their security policy. And this is not going to sound unlike many other security policies across the country. They said every visitor will be required to ring the doorbell at the front entrance. The office staff will use a visual monitoring system to allow entry. Visitors will still be required to report directly to the office and sign in, which is what we presumed was the case. That's so often the procedure in schools across this country right now. We don't know if that in fact played out today, but as that 17-year-old put it moments ago, NJ, this man was armed, this gunman was armed. It makes it almost impossible to follow procedure, but what's going to be frightening for these parents is the rules had been followed and for some time now at this school.
Well, that's right, David, and you have to imagine what their reaction is going to be as this whole story unfolds, as facts come out, and here we are now several hours later, and we're starting to learn about what policies were in place, what policies may have been followed, may not have been followed. You know, in a lot of urban schools in America, and I was listening to your interview earlier, in a lot of urban schools in America, there are metal detectors for people to go into those buildings. But in a place like this, you don't see those metal detectors. You don't see those kinds of security measures. You know, a lot of the security measures go back to that horrific school shooting in Dunblane, Scotland, where I believe it was 15 or 16 young children were shot to death, including their teacher. And that traumatized people there. And this would appear to be, from what we're hearing and seeing, you know, Dunblane times 2. It's absolutely horrific. I've described the scene inside the hospital. We're at Danbury Hospital here, several miles from the school scene shooting, where 3 of the victims were taken. We have not been able to confirm the conditions of those victims. We're hoping to know more shortly. But the scene inside the hospital is just one, as I've described it, of abject grief. You know, nurses crying in the hallways, people, even patients here, inconsolable, trying to wrap their arms, wrap their brains around how something like this can happen. I mean, how evil do you have to be, David, to do something like this?
Well, that in fact is the big question, and we'll have days to try to figure out what was going on in the mind of the person or the people behind such an act. But NJ, one thing that really stopped us in our tracks earlier when we checked in with you was you're at Danbury Hospital, which you just pointed out. That was the designated triage center for this tragedy as it unfolded today. But what's different about the tragedy today is so often you see the gurneys being rushed in with the injured, but the number that you offered, that only 3 people made it to the hospital, would say a lot about perhaps the scene that unfolded in that school.
Well, without question, and you know, the people here, the doctors, nurses, the staff, were hoping that they would be able to treat more people. They only got to treat 3 people, and although it's a different scale, it's a different situation, but it was reminiscent to those of us who covered 9/11 of the scenes outside the hospitals in New York City, where the doctors, the nurses, the hospital staff were waiting for patients who never came, and that's what we're seeing here.
Well, NJ, I know that you were reporting 24 hours now for Channel 7 here in New York, so we appreciate you taking time, a moment to talk with us here on the network. NJ Burkett, part of the ABC team on the ground there in Newtown, Connecticut. And for those of you who are watching from other parts of the country, we'll just give you an idea of where this school is that you're watching aerials of. It's Newtown, Connecticut, about 60 miles northeast of New York City. It's only about a 45-minute drive, or an hour at the most if traffic is good. And as we pull out, you can actually see the town. That's the hospital where NJ was reporting from moments ago, not far from the school. And this morning when the initial call went out, they thought that they were going to be treating a lot of students, dealing with a lot of casualties. Instead, as NJ has been reporting here this morning, so far, only 3 people have been brought to the hospital. And while you don't want anyone to end up in the hospital, the hope was, as this began to unfold, that there would have been a lot more who made it to the hospital, and far fewer who were left behind inside that school. The number is simply staggering. At least 27 dead. That's the latest number that we have. We know many of them are children. We know parents are on the scene. Most of the parents whose children made it out have already been reunited. You can see a picture there in the middle of your screen. That's an adult with what appears to be 3 children there, holding hands, walking out. That is a familiar scene all day. The children holding hands, doing what they were told, and really doing what they were supposed to be doing at that time of the morning. School was underway in that small, picturesque town. They were in their classrooms, and then this was the image that they saw. Authorities arriving, guns drawn as they went from car to car, looking for evidence and initially looking for anyone else who might have been involved. This is the scene. Ambulances there, and they were hoping to be able to help more people, but as we now know, there are many victims inside that school, and it's believed those victims include staff and students, perhaps some teachers who were in their classrooms, and as we've described the layout, it's not unlike any other school in America on a Friday morning. In their classroom, usually just one door in, and if that gunman, that suspect, approached that door, there is not a lot a teacher can do, although teachers in this school today who were able to do something acted with bravery and with courage as you watch them walk out. You could see it on their faces, even in the still images of them walking the children out without their coats. They had told the children to grab a friend's hand and make your way for the door. There's a firehouse around the corner, and that's where they brought the children. Can you imagine the task of trying to get 500 children out of an elementary school, not knowing if the incident had in fact ended or if the scene was secure, but they were trying to get as many of the children out of there as they could. I want to bring in Pierre Thomas, our senior justice correspondent, and Pierre has been following the story from Washington all morning long with his sources. And Pierre, we know very early on the president was notified. I know Jake Tapper's in the briefing room. Perhaps we'll check in with him as the afternoon unfolds here. But in the meantime, take us through how the president is briefed, how quickly this information is getting to him, and we know the governor of Connecticut now briefing the parents.
Now, the way this unfolded, as far as we can tell, is that the FBI, they have local offices throughout the country. The local FBI office was notified about the shooting. They sent personnel to the scene. Then that information made its way to the FBI director. The information made its way to the FBI director. He then informed the president of the scale of the event and how horrific it was. And that's how we understand this went down. We're also beginning to get some additional information about the shooter in this case. We are being told he has been identified as a 24-year-old, and we will be gathering more information to give to our viewers as soon as we get more detail.
Pierre, and you can help me out with this because I've just been handed some information that's been sent out on for our viewers. We have an internal, obviously, email system where we brief each other, and our unit is telling us that this was a 24-year-old man who, obviously, federal authorities are now trying to investigate to determine whether or not he was related in some way to someone inside that school.
I have multiple sources telling me that same information. Again, 24-year-old has emerged as the leading suspect, as the person they believe did the shooting. He is thought to have had a relationship with someone at the school. That is still being investigated. Again, this is a very fluid situation. They're also, as we speak, doing a search at the man's home, and we hope to have some more information about that shortly.
I want to turn back to Brad Garrett, who is a former FBI profiler. He is an ABC News analyst, and he's also coming to us from our Washington bureau today. He was telling us earlier, which we often do after stories like these, try to figure out, try to put some reasoning behind why someone would do this. And obviously we often point to illness after cases like this. But I was struck, Brad, by the age, 24 years old. And some of the other shootings, Columbine, Virginia Tech, they were students at those particular schools involved. But this was an elementary school. And when you hear 24 years old, you immediately think this is a little different from what we've seen.
That's correct. And as we talked earlier, David, what is the connection of the shooter to the school? To go to what Pierre was saying, if in fact there is a child that is the shooter's child or connected to the shooter some way, I'll give you one quick scenario. If this involves a domestic situation, and let's say he's lost custody of this child, in murders of children by the fathers, it's mainly driven many times by wanting to kill the mother and the children because they believe the mother produced this child and no one else is going to have this child, so I'm going to take this child out. Now, why would you do that and kill all these other children if in fact any of that scenario is true is obviously beyond both of us. But the real motive of this, we're going to look at each other and go, how in the world could you kill anybody based on what you're telling me? I think that's going to be the end result. But once you reach a point where nothing else is going to resolve, or you don't believe is going to resolve your situation, and the anger and rage are so great toward perhaps another adult, perhaps toward a child at the school, then you go into this mode where, as I mentioned earlier, you're not killing human beings, you're just inflicting rage. And with that rage, you feel more powerful, at least for the moment. And that's why so many of these shooters either shoot themselves or police shoot them at the end of the rampage.
And of course, we're waiting to hear how this all ended. This morning in Newtown, Connecticut, we do know the shooter inside the building is dead, was wearing a vest, was carrying 4 weapons, is what we believe at this point, 4 weapons. There was one mother that we talked to earlier who described the gunman inside the building as having a mask on as this gunman went through the building. And obviously we'll also be learning more about the path the gunman took, which will obviously help us determine perhaps why this school, why a particular classroom. I want to check in with Dan Harris, who's been there now for hours on the scene. Dan was in fact at that firehouse where those reunions were taking place. He's also been at the scene of the school. And Dan, I can only imagine the scene between the governor, Dan Malloy there in Connecticut, and the parents who are waiting to hear. And you're on the scene there for us. What are you seeing?
It's got to be a wrenching job that the governor has in front of him right now. We've actually seen him briefly. We saw him leaving the firehouse, which is right here behind me, and we saw him coming back. We know that, as his spokesman said earlier, that he's been speaking with the parents. One can imagine that that is what is taking place right now. This is the volunteer firehouse right down this street, which is marked with a painted black and white wooden sign, very New England, that says Sandy Hook Elementary School. Right down this street, that's where the elementary school is. The children were rushed out of the school when the shooting began and brought here to this elementary school, and that's where we've seen parents coming here to be reunited with their children, many of them frantic, all of them tearful. It's one of the most poignant things we've seen today, truly one of the most horrifying things we've seen, David, are the parents, or at least married couples, leaving here arm in arm without their children. One can simply use basic logic to deduce that perhaps they lost their child. There will be more than 20 parents who get terrible, terrible news today as this unfolds. And the governor is doing some of that hard work right now, one presumes. The other thing we're seeing here today are ambulances leaving the school without their lights on, with no urgency whatsoever. One would imagine, as you discussed with N.J. Burkett before, that they would much rather be taking the wounded to the hospital instead of simply just dealing with the dead, which is what it appears they're doing right now.
Dan, I know you're standing about an hour away from the studio here in New York, and you and I were standing in the hallway outside our offices here this morning when we got that call, and I was standing out in the hall and heard, as we were discussing, as you were on the way out, and we never know when we leave for these stories how they'll unfold. We didn't know if it was large or if it was small, and the numbers are simply staggering, and I just want to bring people up to date who are just joining our live coverage now at just about 2:30 now Eastern. At least 27 shot and killed, many of them children, and that's Dan Harris at the scene, who's been there all morning long, and he's been witnessing much like what you're seeing right now. The aerial views, the ambulances pulling up, and as Dan pointed out, pulling away without their sirens, without anyone in the back. As is so often the case, we see gurneys and injured victims leaving these schools, these incidents across America. And in this case, one of the main differences is that as of right now, we only know of 3 people being treated at a local hospital, which would leave you to presume that any of the other people inside that school who were targeted did not make it out of the school. And that number, more than 24 people inside that school, is really something that, quite frankly, we'll all have to get our heads around. It's the worst shooting at an elementary school that we can remember. The only shooting where there were more victims, Virginia Tech. But to imagine the ages of these children, these young faces inside these classrooms, and the horror that they went through this morning. And one of the things that we were struck by, as we've been reporting this throughout the afternoon here, as you're watching ABC News Live coverage, is the reaction from the children when you juxtapose it with some of the older people, the parents and the older teenagers who were so worried about their little brothers and sisters. We heard from one 17-year-old boy who said, "I needed calming down myself." We heard him say that his mother was screaming, and understandably. But then when we saw that, and then saw the pictures of the children being brought outside, and reports that there were tears, there was some crying, but that there was no screaming. This was calm. These children all did what they'd been told to do. They all listened to their teachers, and those teachers need to be commended as we now sort of see the scope of the tragedy that played out inside their school this morning. They were told to get their students out and to a nearby fire hall. I want to bring in Lieutenant Paul Vanance of the State Police in Connecticut. He spoke a short time ago. It was the first and only time we've heard from authorities so far. He offered this about what transpired.
Just after 9:30 this morning, Newtown Police received a 911 call for an emergency at the elementary school. Newtown PD, upon obtaining information as to the stature of the situation, contacted the Connecticut State Police and requested assistance from state police and surrounding local police departments. On and off-duty troopers responded to the school, and with Newtown Police, immediately upon arrival, entered the school and began a complete active shooter search of the building. That included checking every door, every crack, every crevice, every portion of that school. Our main objective was to evacuate as quickly and efficiently as possible any and all students and faculty in the school. The entire school was searched. That was accomplished. A staging area was set up. The students and staff were put into that staging area, and soon thereafter the children and staff were reunited with their parents and their loved ones. There were several fatalities at the scene, both students and staff. There is no information relative to that that is being released at this time until we've made complete and proper notification. The shooter is deceased inside the building. There's a great deal of work that is undertaken immediately upon locating the shooter, and that is there's a great deal of search warrant activity, there's a great deal of law enforcement activity both in and out of state to ensure that we cover all the bases relative to that specific individual. Suffice it to say, the scene is secure. State Police Major Crime Squad, Newtown Police Department, Danbury State's Attorney, and many agencies are working together to answer all the questions surrounding exactly what happened.
That was the lieutenant with the Connecticut Police Department, Lieutenant Paul Vance, describing the scene there in extraordinary effort on the part of the teachers there, the administrators, and of course the authorities. When they arrived, they went through room by room inside that school, and they secured that scene as rapidly as anyone could have, called in and not knowing what they would come upon. They are now, of course, dealing with a tragedy of historic nature. The numbers are, look at this scene that you're looking at right now. These are some of the pictures coming in from our ABC stations in the region, and this is what children left that school and saw. These officers, and as you can see, FBI, state police there, guns drawn, going car to car throughout the neighborhood. You can only imagine, not only do parents have to describe why children left that school, but what it was they were seeing with so many people armed and ready to deal with the situation. We heard from Dan Harris a short time ago, who described the parents who came to the school and in many cases taking off their coats, wrapping their children in their coats because the children were simply told to get out, to grab a friend, to walk toward the exit. And we did hear from parents earlier, and for those of you who've joined us just recently, we should tell you that my colleague Diane Sawyer is on the scene. She'll be broadcasting from there for World News. But in the meantime, here are some of the parents and what they told Diane a little earlier here. We'll bring that to you again as soon as we have it, and we have it now. Here it is.
That all schools were in lockdown, and it didn't say what school. Then a neighbor said that they heard that it was Sandy Hook, which is where our children go, and we immediately jumped in the car and headed here. There's a parent I know who happened to be in the building at the time, and she's pretty broken up. She was in a meeting with the principal and some other people, and they heard shooting. They got up, they went out, and she had stayed in the conference room, and my understanding from her is the principal and other people got shot when they went out into the hallway, and she was the one who called 911.
I worked so close that I saw the first cop cars rolling down there, so I just literally ran down there, and I got pretty much up to the school with a bunch of other parents that were right on the scene. And as they were leading the kids out, single file, and I saw him right away and just went with him at that point.
And how shaken was Edwin? What did he want to talk to you about?
He does not really want to talk about it. He's just scared and shaken. He told us that he didn't see, he heard, and that everyone and teacher are all okay. And so right now we're just focused on comforting him.
I heard that children were taken out bloody. Several teachers and mother who was actually in the school said that a masked man came in and started firing.
My wife and I drove right over there, and when we arrived, I would say there was probably about 40 parents there or so, and they were just gathering children at the firehouse. It did become a very chaotic situation, obviously, because everyone was trying to get their children out. But like I said, between the police and the fire department personnel that were there, and especially the school teachers, I am just so proud of the way that our town has responded to this.
That sums it up for the people and the parents who were able to be reunited with their children today. That father said it perfectly. He said, "I am just so proud of the way this town has handled this. We wouldn't wish this on any town in America." You can see the hugs playing out this afternoon, police tape drawn around the scene as authorities continue to investigate. But I do want to bring in Pierre Thomas. We have breaking developments involving not only the name of the gunman, but we know a little more about where he's from and some other discoveries. Pierre, let's bring our viewers up to date.
David, we're being told by multiple sources that the shooter has been identified as a man by the name of Ryan Lanza, 24 years old. And we're told that his mother, who was a teacher at the school, is among those deceased. Again, Ryan Lanza, 24 years old, identified as the shooter. And again, the relationship at the school is apparently his mother, and she was among those killed.
That was the suspicion since first thing this morning, Pierre. As you know, the two of us have covered so many of these, and you just hate to have to confirm it, but so often this is the case, that the gunman or the suspect in these cases has some sort of personal connection, some sort of relationship with someone inside the school. And there you heard Pierre Thomas, our senior justice correspondent, reporting that it's Ryan Lanza is the name. He's from New Jersey, and he's 24 years old. It's believed his mother was a teacher in the school. Pierre reporting there a moment ago. It's believed she did not survive, along with at least 26 others. The total is at least 27 dead and counting, many of them children. And as we, in the coming hours, learn about the families who will have just the horrific journey ahead after learning that perhaps their child did not survive. We know that the governor is on the scene. He's been meeting with parents. And we know that there was a significant number of children and staff members who did not make it out of that school. Brad Garrett has been with us all morning long. He is a former FBI profiler. And forgive me, Brad, but we always hate it when we have to come to you, because it means typically that we're trying to get into the mind of someone who'd be capable of something like this. But this is the kind of piecing together that profilers like you do in a case like this. 24 years old, and his mother was a teacher there. It's what we believe at this hour.
And so what you take away from that is that there is something going on, and probably long term, between the two of them. And he wanted to, beyond killing her, because obviously someone that would commit this type of act could have killed his mother at any point. He wanted to inflict injury on others beyond his mother, and perhaps what she stood for in reference to the school. David, keep in mind, people who do these things, a lot of it is driven by delusions. That doesn't make them legally crazy, but the delusion is, this has harmed me, this woman has harmed me, she teaches these children, and so I'm going to get rid of her and the world around her. It could be that. It could even tie into possibly something in his own childhood and a relationship with her. But it's my belief, without knowing anything else, this goes beyond just her. It goes on maybe perhaps what she represents, in addition to obviously killing her.
Brad, stick with us here. I want to go back to Pierre. And Pierre, what do we know about this 24-year-old and his home? Perhaps some of the other areas where he might have inflicted pain today, other than this school?
Well, again, this is a very fluid situation. We know there's a search ongoing at a residence in New Jersey, thought to be the residence of his parents. Again, we're trying to get some additional reporting about what is happening at the home. We're not quite ready to release that information just yet until we're 100% sure that we know it's accurate. But again, what my sources are telling me is that this 24-year-old Ryan Lanza appears to have gone on a shooting spree at multiple locations, and that we may find additional dead bodies.
Chilling to hear that development. Now 2:40 in the afternoon. We've been following this since shortly after 9:30 this morning when we got those initial calls. And as you heard Pierre Thomas our justice correspondent report there moments ago, and authorities are now investigating a 24-year-old whose name is Ryan Lanza. It's believed he's from New Jersey. And as Pierre said, investigators are now at the home investigating whether or not he might have inflicted pain on other people. Pierre reporting that it is possible that the school was not his only target, and we'll check back in with him as soon as we hear about any possible victims, perhaps inside the home. As soon as we get the information, we will turn back to Pierre. But in the meantime, what we do know this afternoon is that this was a 24-year-old. His name on the screen there, Ryan Lanza of New Jersey. His mother was a teacher at the school, and at this point it is believed she did not get out. She was one of the at least 27 people who were killed inside that school. I don't know what she taught at the school, but I'm guessing we'll learn that quite shortly, since we often are able to get school lists. They're parts of these communities. The teachers who proudly teach whatever their subject is, whatever the grade level it is that they've been assigned to for the year. And as you look at the calendar, we're halfway through December, and this typically is a joyous time inside schools across this country. Children finishing their first few months of school, and they get that break that they so look forward to, that extended break that takes them through Christmas and the New Year's holidays, and this. You can only imagine some of the holiday parties they had planned in those classrooms, and I'm sure the decorations they had up and down those hallways. But what we do know is that was all turned upside down inside this school, Sandy Hook Elementary School, Newtown, Connecticut. And just look at these images, the children with their arms wrapped around their parents. This little boy with his hands up to his face, and the tears. So often we've heard throughout the day here that the children were the ones who were calmest, who were the most quiet. There were tears, there were cries, but the most vociferous were the older people, the parents and the older students, who were so worried about whether or not their younger siblings would make it out. And we heard from a 17-year-old who was just incredibly relieved to find out his fourth grade sister had made it out. And now will come the difficult task for the families who picked up those children to just explain to them what even we as adults, and particularly those of us in this industry who report on these tragedies, so often have to answer the same questions every time, which is how can someone do this? Were there red flags? Could anything have been done to prevent the tragedy that unfolded here today? Historic in nature, as I've mentioned here this morning. As we know, Virginia Tech, at this point, as we look back, it appears Virginia Tech is the only shooting that was deadlier than the one that we're reporting on here this morning. And that was something we'll never forget at Virginia Tech. But at schools, elementary schools, middle schools across America, we have never seen anything like this. The numbers are simply stopping everyone who is turning on their television or certainly online today. And for those of you who aren't able to sit in front of the TV, I can assure you that our team at abcnews.com following this moment by moment as well, particularly for the families in that community who are waiting for word. We were talking with N.J. Burkett earlier, and he's moved on to continue reporting from the scene. He works for WABC here in New York. And to give you an idea, it's about an hour from here, northeast of New York City. But he was reporting from the hospital, which is Danbury Hospital. And that was the dedicated hospital for this incident the moment the call came in. And you can see in a map there sort of the geography that we're talking about. New York there in the lower left-hand corner. Newtown not far away. And in Danbury, that's where the hospital was. And they had prepared for this. NJ reporting that the nurses, the teams inside that hospital, shaken, but I'm sure determined to help the people who came through that door. But what was stunning to hear in this case was that only 3 people that we know of so far being treated at the hospital. And Dan Harris confirming that so many of the ambulances that you see right there, that is the scene. Those ambulances pulling up and sitting there. There were no lights, no sirens, and very few of them, if any, left the scene with anyone to be saved. And that is simply staggering. That is one of the things about this that makes it just so heinous and so hard to comprehend, is that the people here who did not make it out of that school didn't even have a chance. At least 27. We know that many of them are children and Brad Garrett, our FBI profiler, who we turn to in these cases, talking about how people who commit these kinds of crimes, particularly when they walk in and into a school like this, and it's so impossible to understand how they could target young children who are in their classrooms doing just what it is they're told to do, how they could do this, commit this with children who are so innocent. And as I mentioned a moment ago, just showing up to school knowing this in a couple of weeks, and if I remember correctly, I'm sure every one of those children had the countdown in their head. How many days left, not only for many of them to celebrate Christmas, but for many of them to take a holiday break, to have some time with their family, and to celebrate New Year's, to see what would be brought to them under the tree, brought to them during Hanukkah in these recent days. We do know that the president has been briefed on this repeatedly throughout the day. Our Jake Tapper in the briefing room, and we'll check in with him when we can and when news warrants. We know that the president reached out to Connecticut's governor, Dan Malloy, who is on the scene, and he has the nearly impossible task of meeting with the parents who do not know where their children are. And what we don't know at about 10 to 3 now this afternoon is whether or not the parents have in fact been told, the parents of the victims, the family members of the teachers who were showing up to do their work today and won't be coming home after this unfolded today. We believe the president will be speaking in a half hour's time. We will be staying with you, and you can be assured we will bring you the president just as soon as he appears before the cameras. Those of you who have followed this presidency and who has not know that this is a president who has often talked about his 2 daughters and how what they see at school during the day, what they see with their friends, shapes the way he leads in many of the issues that he's tackled as president. And there's no question that he will appear before that camera today, not only as our president, but as a father as well. In fact, Jay Carney, a spokesman for the White House, saying earlier this morning that the president is affected as any parent would be, thinking of his own children. I want to bring in ABC's Dr. Jen Ashton, who's with us as well. And as we await the president, we expect, Jen, to hear from him within the half hour. He's a father too, and there's this really delicate task in the next hours and days to not overtalk this, but to talk it through with your children, and what a task it is.
It is an unfathomable task, David, and I don't think you have to be a parent to imagine this will impact every person who hears this story, because it's really not about being a parent, it's not about being a teacher, it's about being a human being. The mental health aspect of this issue and this story and this tragedy is enormous. There's the issue of shock and trauma to the children who were immediately at the scene. There's the issue of shock and trauma to the teachers, to the faculty, to the first responders. And that shock wave will continue out to everyone in the country, if not the world, who hears this story. You have to be concerned with reactive depression, PTSD. That those are first and foremost. And when you talk about the shooter, David, this is the face of mental illness. By definition, this is really what you cannot commit a crime like this without an element of acute psychosis. And I just am having a hard time putting all these thoughts into words, as I know so many people are. It's just unthinkable.
Well, Jen, your perspective is so welcomed. And when you talk about mental illness, you know, I have to ask the question that so many are asking, which was, if that is the case, there had to have been warning signs, flags along the way. And what do we do as a country to try to reach out and try to prevent these things? Because mental illness often presents itself long before we get to something like this.
That's right. And, we have an opportunity, which unfortunately we've had all too often in the recent past, to bring that to the forefront of people's minds here. But, make no mistake about it, the definition of acute psychosis, by definition, is impaired reality testing, impaired sense of judgment. No one can commit a crime like this while having a normal sense of reality and intact judgment. And when you talk about what can we do to bring this mental illness issue to the forefront,
Obviously, cell phones getting the best of us. Dr. Jen Ashton, part of our medical team here. We're working on, by the way, an hour for World News this evening. My teammate Diane Sawyer on the scene. She'll be reporting. She's talked with many of the parents there already, and we've heard from those parents throughout the morning. It'll be a special 1-hour edition, obviously, of World News coming up a little later today. Nightline tonight will be on this, abcnews.com throughout the day. But the medical team has been working nonstop from the moment this headline came in. And I want to bring in Rich Besser, Dr. Richard Besser. And Rich, so often your reporting is informed by your role as a dad as well. And so for parents watching this, and we have pointed this out throughout the day, that you'll want to, probably get your children away from the television set. It's just not something they should have to deal with as we do in trying to investigate what happened here today. But what do you tell your children, even if you don't live in that community? Because as we know, in the age of the internet and Twitter and everything else, it's going to be almost inescapable.
You're right, David. This kind of event, you can't shield older children from. They're going to be seeing this. I received a text from my high school son this afternoon saying, "Dad, what's the story in Connecticut? This is absolutely horrible." And so you need to engage your children. You need to know your child and know how they respond to stress. As Jen Ashton was saying, we've seen far too many of these events. And you may have some understanding of how your child is going to respond to something that's so difficult to understand. And how you address your child, how you express yourself, will really have, again, because of that. You want to share your thoughts, but you don't want to project your own fears on the situation. Given the child who
We'll check back in with Rich again. All of our team calling in, as dedicated as they are, but often the best of those cell phones, as we're moving either to the scene or trying to get into the newsroom, get the best of us, like those calls with our family all day long that get cut out now and then. But we'll check back in with both Dr. Besser and Dr. Ashton as the afternoon develops here. It's now closing in on 3 o'clock this afternoon. We have learned from the White House that President Obama will make a statement today. He was informed this morning. He has been briefed several times throughout the morning. He'll address the nation on perhaps the worst school shooting in American history for an elementary school. That is our belief this afternoon. And as we know, he's just begun what will be a second term. He has not been inaugurated yet, but the election behind him. And these are the things presidents have to get in front of the camera, reassure the nation that we will do everything we can to make sure that we minimize the potential for this to happen again. And you can see the woman right there, the anguish on her face, holding a cell phone to her ear. This little girl, pigtails in her hair, the mother there presumably holding another child. And it's just something that's just we don't expect on a Friday morning, closing in on the Christmas, the holiday season in schools across America, when school children think they're almost there, they're almost to that prized vacation that they've earned, and that visit, perhaps from Santa, or if they're celebrating other holidays this time of year. And this is just not anything we would wish on any school, on any little person in this country, is what they had to go through today. For those of you who just joined us, I want to bring you up to date on what we know. The gunman has now been identified as 24-year-old Ryan Lanza of New Jersey. It's believed his mother was a teacher at the school, and we presume there had to have been some sort of relationship between the gunman and someone in the school, and we learned not long ago that it's a mother and son. We believe that the mother did not make it out, that she was a teacher there. We don't know what she taught at the school, but we'll, I'm sure, learn that as the hours unfold here. Pierre Thomas also reporting in from our Washington bureau that the investigation extends beyond this school, that there is also a scene being investigated in New Jersey, believed to be the home or a home related to this family, where perhaps this 24-year-old inflicted even more harm. Pierre not ready to report anything beyond that, but it is believed that authorities are not convinced that this school was the only place where this 24-year-old, police believe, inflicted such incredible horror. We know from the scene a first-grade teacher, and this is the kind of heroism that we always report, and it's been stunning how quickly we have learned in this case of the stories of the bravery of these teachers. A first grade teacher locking her kids in a bathroom. She said the kids were being so good, they simply asked, can we go see if anyone is out there? They were worried about others. And as I talked about Christmas vacation nearing, I'm reading this quote right now that's been handed to me. Some of the children telling their first grade teacher, I just want Christmas. I don't want to die. I just want to have Christmas. The teacher said, she replied to them, you're going to have Christmas, you're going to have Hanukkah. She simply tried to be positive. And that is the extraordinary tale of just one teacher. And boy, do we applaud all of them who got those children out of the school. Many of them saying, leave everything behind, doesn't matter, grab a friend, and let's get out. And the single file lines that you saw, and look at this image, this is what those children emerged to see. So many authorities, their guns drawn. We keep coming back to this mother. This is, that sums it up. Cell phone to her ear, agony. We know that at 3:30 this afternoon, it's just before 3 o'clock Eastern time. At 3:30, we're expecting to hear from Governor Dan Malloy. He's the governor of Connecticut, his state, dealing with so much anguish this afternoon, and he had the impossible task of showing up at that school and meeting with the parents who did not know if their children had survived it. And after hours have gone by, if you haven't been reunited with your child, the fear and the reality of this is going to be something that we'll be reporting on, and something that we wouldn't wish on any parent going to that school. But at 3:30, we're expecting to hear from the governor. We heard from authorities one time today who came to the cameras trying to reassure that community and the country now tuning in to watch this. They offered as much as they could, which was the fact that authorities arrived at the scene. They got calls 9:30 this morning. We're there a short time later. You can see them walking across the roof of the school. They went in, they searched every classroom, went down the hallways, and trying to make sure that the school was secure. You have to keep in mind, when you looked at those pictures of the teachers bringing the children out, they did not know whether or not the school had been secured or not. And that story of that first grade teacher locking her children in the bathroom, and the children telling her, I just want Christmas, I don't want to die, and the role she played in keeping them calm and then getting them out. Dan Harris, one of the anchors here at ABC News, has been on the scene all morning long, and he was at the firehouse, the triage point, and this struck me earlier. It's sort of a sign of the times, the technology and how it can help us in these situations. There were these reverse alerts that were texted out to parents in the community to go to that firehouse to find their child. And Dan, as I understand it, at first the text didn't make it completely clear which school was involved, and so you can only imagine how this sort of spread like a shockwave through this community.
Absolutely. Speaking to parents who got that text, it just said there's been a shooting, you need to come pick up your child. It didn't say which school. I think a lot of parents immediately assumed it was the high school, not an elementary school, not a school with such young children. In fact, we heard a story about that from a parent who was talking about the fear that she felt when the moment that text came in. It's just a horrifying moment. And, we don't expect a school shooting to take place anywhere, but of all places, really this place, Newtown, Connecticut, is really a truly surprising place for this to happen. This is a small town, less than 30,000 people, southern New England, beautiful place. This is a place where the town symbol is a rooster, a place that had a historical role in the Revolutionary War, a place where the word game Scrabble was invented. Absolutely not a place, a backdrop, you'd think, for this sort of unspeakable violence. David?
Dan, stick with us here. We're going to check in with some of the people that you have talked to on the scene in a moment. For those of us here on the desk in New York, and for the viewers who have tuned in throughout the afternoon, we're just shy of 3 o'clock Eastern time. We wanted to recap this unfolding situation in Newtown, Connecticut at Sandy Hook Elementary School. It was a 911 call that alerted us all that something had gone terribly wrong at this school about 9:30 this morning. The shooter has been identified as Ryan Lanza, 24 years old. It's believed his mother, it's been confirmed to ABC News that his mother was among the victims. She's a teacher at Sandy Hook School. The shooter is deceased inside the school. We don't know how this ended for him. We know authorities have been called to the scene immediately. We believe that he was wearing a vest, that he was armed. Right now we believe he had 4 weapons. There was one mother that you heard from earlier who described a masked gunman that we can't confirm that until authorities offer more, and we do expect to hear from them within the hour now. The governor will be speaking in about a half an hour. President Obama briefing with his advisors at the White House, and he'll be talking to the nation at some point this afternoon. His role as president, but really he'll play the role today as father-in-chief with his two daughters. He often speaks about them, about how they influence his role as the leader of this nation. And Dan, we want to come back to you now. We were talking to you moments ago. You've been on that scene since this morning. You described in such vivid detail those reunions, the embraces that you saw at that firehouse, and you've actually talked with some of these families about this ordeal.
Yeah, just to set the scene as I prepare to show you this conversation we had just a while ago. This behind me is the volunteer firehouse that is literally right down the street from the school, Sandy Hook Elementary School, where this violence played out this morning. This is where students were brought by their teachers in the aftermath of the violence. They were brought here. The parents were told to come pick their children up, and this is where those reunions played out, and this is where the parents who came and unfortunately are not going to be able to have a reunion are, we believe right now, meeting with the governor. I had a conversation with a mother and her child in the 3rd grade just a short while ago. Here it is. What happened?
Nothing really much. We heard like an ambulance and a police officer come, and everybody was a little scared, crying, and I felt actually a little sick, and I felt like I was gonna throw up, and I felt that to my teacher too.
How did you get out of there?
We had to go through the building, and then we had to just go to the firehouse.
And did you know what was happening at the time?
No, until our next door neighbor, Mrs. Walker, which is one of our friends, and then she said that like there's a lockdown, you guys just gotta be calm, and then her class came to our room, and then we just do that.
Were kids crying and screaming?
Yeah, kids were crying, not really like screaming, but they're all huddling together, and they felt so sick.
And how old are you?
8.
You're 8 years old. And what's your name again?
Alexis.
What's your last name?
Dwasik.
How do I spell that?
Wasik.
And what, you're in 4th grade? 3rd grade. 3rd grade. How did you find out about this?
They actually have an alert system through the school, and so they sent a message saying something, I don't even remember the message, something about lockdown, and so I figured it was, honestly, I figured fires were the high school, and little did I know that it was actually here, so I actually called my husband and said, can you go find out what it actually was, what are they talking about? And he goes, get in the car and drive, go get her to school, I'll meet you at the school. So he got here and I got here, and he had her in his arms, and and I'm crying, and so she just goes, Mama, I'm okay, I'm here. But it just doesn't even seem real. I mean, I'm still like, really? I mean, here in Newtown, in this small town, and you read about this everywhere else but here, and it's heart-wrenching for the children and for the parents and grandparents and everybody. I can't fathom. It just doesn't even seem real. It's like, should I be pinched to see if it really is real? And it's just heart-wrenching.
Feels like a dream, and a bad dream.
It's a nightmare. It feels like a nightmare, and you just never in a million years would you ever think, you drop your child off at school, hugs and kisses, have a good day, I'll see you later, and see you at the end of the day, and you never know, are you still going to have, in 20 minutes from now, what's going to happen, and you count your blessings every day for what you have.
Alexis, I'm really glad you're okay. I'm really glad you're okay. You're pretty tough.
You are too.
You're pretty tough.
We are too.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to... A tough little girl. And David, what struck me the most about this interview, and it may have struck you as well, is the body language between mother and daughter. The mother was clearly so relieved that Alexis is okay. And one cannot forget that in this building behind me right now, there are parents who do not have that luxury of knowing their children are okay. And one of the most poignant things here today is seeing families leaving without children. We don't know exactly what their story is, but we've seen quite a few couples leaving here today who are distraught and without their children. And one can only imagine what it is like for them this afternoon.
We hate to hear that, Dan. And the mother you were just talking with, Alexis's mother, saying, how could it be in Newtown? We read about it everywhere else. So often the refrain after horrific shootings like this one, how could it happen here? Particularly at a school where we know in the last year, for this school year, they enacted even a greater security policy. You can't lock these schools down, as we all know, but they had taken precautions to try to make it safer. The little girl who said, I felt sick to my stomach. And you can only imagine what her classmates, all of those other little students who lined up to get out of that school felt as they were trying to get out too. The children hiding in that first grade bathroom with their teacher, one of them saying, I just want Christmas. I don't want to die. And the mother, the teacher, I should say, perhaps a mother, because her instincts were just extraordinary. And she said, you'll have Christmas, you'll have Hanukkah. And she said, my number one goal was to keep these kids positive. You heard Dan there ask Alexis to spell her name. I just want to let folks at home know he wasn't quizzing her, although she brilliantly answered very quickly. But that's often what we do when we interview people out in the field, just to make sure we have their name spelled correctly and their age. We want to get it all right. So Dan Harris there on the scene with so many families and the pain that's unfolding there this afternoon. I wanted to turn to Jake Tapper. He's been in the briefing room at the White House for much of the day. And Jake, we're expecting to hear from the president a short time from now.
President Obama will be coming here to the Brady press briefing room at 3:15. We're expecting him shortly before the governor of Connecticut speaks. He was briefed on the events of the day at 10:30 this morning by his Homeland Security advisor, John Brennan, and he has been briefed throughout the day. He had a conversation with the FBI director, Mueller, and the governor of Connecticut as well, offering his condolences. It's a day of some anguish here when the press secretary came out to brief the press. He seemed shaken, no more shaken than many of us, of course, by the news. When asked about how the president was personally reacting to the story, the press secretary was reluctant to confirm any of the details that we were starting to get at that point about just how horrific this incident actually was. But he said as a father, events like these weigh very heavily on the president. So we will hear from him in a few days, in a few moments. This, of course, is one of the roles the president, any president, plays in a situation like this. The role of consoler-in-chief, comforter-in-chief, trying to reassure the nation at specific times about what's going on. He, of course, after the Tucson shooting, filled that role. And we remember other presidents, George W. Bush with 9/11, President Clinton with the Oklahoma City bombing, fulfilling that role as well. It is a challenging time, of course, and a challenging task for any president. Dave.
Jake, you've covered President Obama when he was a candidate, his first term, and as he approaches his second term, and you have noticed better than any of us here how often the president mentions the fact that he's a father, and that helps to inform his decision-making, his role as a leader, Sasha and Malia, and he'll be like every other parent in this country who will have to talk about what happened today, only he'll have to do it in front of the nation. But he often has to let those instincts as a father kick in as well, Jake.
That's exactly right, David. When it comes to moments like this, especially involving young children, many of us, no matter what job we have, whether it's president, reporter, or any of the listeners or viewers watching right now, our first instinct, of course, is to react as a parent, the desire to go and hug your child. I think President Obama has that instinct just as all the rest of us do. It's why the press secretary, who is the father of two small children, also came out and seemed rather shaken during this press conference, knowing, of course, the news before many of us did in the press. It does inform how he seeks to console the nation, and it will inform how he speaks to the nation this evening, or this afternoon, especially speaking to the parents, so many millions of parents who have been shaken by this event today, David.
Jake, thanks so much. I know you've been in the briefing room all morning long and into this afternoon, and it's hard to believe how quickly this unfolded today into what really is the worst shooting at an elementary school here in the United States. And to bring people up to date, it's about 10 after 3 now. Many of you have been with us for many hours in this together as we've watched this unfold, and we sure do appreciate that you've shared this with us. But I wanted to bring those who've just joined us up to speed on what we know. These are the images from Newtown, Connecticut. It's, of course, Sandy Hook Elementary School. It's been flashed across screens, across the networks, across the internet all day today. It's believed 500 school children or thereabouts attend this school, and so many of the reunions here today, the children, her little face, this mom distraught. There were many, many reunions, and sadly this afternoon, this boy gets me every time with his hands to his face, but we know that this afternoon there were many parents who've been briefed by the governor there in Connecticut, many of them leaving the school distraught and without any children by their side, as Dan Harris reported moments ago, and it struck us all here in the studio. That is going to be the most difficult part of reporting this story out, is to watch as this unfolds in a tiny, picturesque New England town on a sunny Friday morning. School children finishing their week, and as we all know, if we have children in our lives, that the countdown is on. Many marking Hanukkah, many doing the countdown in their head to Christmas. They were approaching the end of what would be another week or two of school before they would head home for the holiday, wait for Santa's arrival if they've been good this year, and mark the new year with their parents before heading back to school. That story from a first grade teacher, and there'll be many more of these stories, there always are. The first grade teacher who said, I locked my school children in the bathroom and I tried to remain positive, and one of them just said, I just want Christmas. So boy, those children who walked out of that school today deserve Christmas and more. They were told, many of these school children, to leave everything behind. As I've mentioned, those of you who've been with us, I have talked about this before, but they were told, we need to leave, and leave all your things behind. It was a cold, chilly morning here in the northeastern part of this country. Many of them holding hands, and the reaction from those teachers who looked intent on getting their children out, calm, but you could see the anxiety on their faces, and we've heard it as the day has unfolded. How could it have possibly happened here? We do know that the president is expected to speak shortly. We will bring that to you from the White House. He's been briefed all morning long. He's reached out almost immediately to Connecticut's governor, Dan Malloy, who's on the scene. He offered condolences, said we will do anything we can for your state. The governor there, meeting with parents who came for their children and did not find their children at the firehouse. And he's expected to speak also within the hour. 3:30 was the time given to us, but as we know, we'll hardly keep them to it on a day like today when they're dealing with the raw emotion that follows such an enormous tragedy. Pierre Thomas tracking the investigation. And Pierre, as we wait for the president to address this nation, what's the latest about the gunman and about his relationship with someone inside that school?
The shooter, that his mother was among those killed at the school, and that some of her students may have been targets.
Pierre, we believe that she was in fact a teacher?
Yes.
And what do we know about the other part of this investigation, that it might not just be the school they're looking at this hour, that there are authorities elsewhere?
Indeed, David. The FBI and local authorities are at a number of scenes, including the parents' home. They are doing a methodical search. We will have some additional guidance on whether other people have been injured. We're not quite ready to report that information just yet, but that is one of the concerns going forward.
Part of the reporting that's coming in from the scene, we have reports that at the scene, someone who went to school with Ryan Lanza, the father of a young woman who went to school with him, went to high school with him, he's 24 now, so this was a few years back, said his daughter had called him to say she had heard what happened, and she described him as a quiet kind of kid, seemed to get sort of lost in the shuffle. And of course, that's just one tiny piece of this puzzle. It's sort of the first little window we have to this 24-year-old. We do not know what the motive could have been, though, as Pierre just reported, he did enter that school knowing that his mother was inside, had begun her school day as a teacher there at that Connecticut elementary school. We know that at least 27 have been shot and killed, and this morning, just watching that number increase was a frightening thing for many people across this country as they were tuning in. That's where it stands, at least 27, and it puts this town, Newtown, Connecticut, in the history books for all the wrong reasons. Now the deadliest shooting at an elementary school or a middle school in America. We know that Virginia Tech still ranks as the deadliest. That was an awful scene, we all remember that. Columbine, of course, we all remember. And this country joined arms and said we were going to do whatever we could to stop these kinds of scenes from playing out ever again, although It is almost impossible to do. There will be talk in the hours and the days that follow about gun laws in this country, about mental illness, about signs that could have been missed. But the talk this afternoon is about the families who've now lost little boys and little girls, and many families who are waiting for their mom or dad to come home. Staff members inside that school, teachers and other staff members who we've been told did not make it out as well. We're going to hear from the president here moments from now, and as Jake pointed out, so often presidents are called upon at these times of great national grief to stand before the camera, to be the comforter-in-chief. He'll be the father-in-chief because he often talks about his own two girls with great pride. They've gone to great lengths in the White House to protect his own daughters. And here's the president now to the nation.
This afternoon, I spoke with Governor Malloy and FBI Director Mueller. I offered Governor Malloy my condolences on behalf of the nation and made it clear he will have every single resource that he needs to investigate this heinous crime, care for the victims, counsel their families. We've endured too many of these tragedies in the past few years, and each time I learn the news, I react not as a president, but as anybody else would, as a parent. And that was especially true today. I know there's not a parent in America who doesn't feel the same overwhelming grief that I do. The majority of those who died today were children. Beautiful little kids between the ages of 5 and 10 years old. They had their entire lives ahead of them. Birthdays, graduations, weddings, kids of their own. Among the fallen were also teachers, men and women who devoted their lives to helping our children fulfill their dreams. So our hearts are broken today for the parents and grandparents, sisters and brothers of these little children, and for the families of the adults who were lost. Our hearts are broken for the parents of the survivors as well. For as blessed as they are to have their children home tonight, they know that their children's innocence has been torn away from them too early, and there are no words that will ease their pain. As a country, we have been through this too many times. Whether it's an elementary school in Newtown, or a shopping mall in Oregon, or a temple in Wisconsin, or a movie theater in Aurora, or a street corner in Chicago, these neighborhoods are our neighborhoods, and these children are our children. And we're going to have to come together and take meaningful action to prevent more tragedies like this, regardless of the politics. This evening, Michelle and I will do what I know every parent in America will do, which is hug our children a little tighter, and we'll tell them that we love them, and we'll remind each other how deeply we love one another. But there are families in Connecticut who cannot do that tonight, and they need all of us right now. In the hard days to come, that community needs us to be at our best as Americans, and I will do everything in my power as president to help. Because while nothing can fill the space of a lost child or loved one, all of us can extend a hand to those in need, to remind them that we are there for them, that we are praying for them, that the love they felt for those they lost endures not just in their memories, but also in ours. May God bless the memory of the victims. And in the words of Scripture, heal the brokenhearted and bind up their wounds.
President Obama addressing the nation 3:20 in the afternoon, hours after that first call came in after 9:30 this morning. The president there in the briefing room wiping away what appeared to be tears And not surprisingly, as we all watch this, it's an extraordinarily sad and tragic day we're all witnessing in Connecticut. The president saying, I react not as a president, but as a parent. And Jake, this is a man who just endured a tough campaign. He's in the middle of a fiscal fight in Washington. But when we often see him at his most emotional moments, it's when he's talking about his role as a father.
It's when he's talking about young people. That's exactly right. And David, I'm not sure if you were able to see, but let me just tell you, from 4 feet away, those were absolutely tears that the president was wiping away from his face several times, talking about what it must be like for those parents to be in Connecticut this evening, talking about how the majority of those who were killed today in Newtown, Connecticut, were children, as he described them, beautiful little kids between 5 and 10 years old, talking about how their lives, the things that they would want to do in their lives, having children of their own, would never happen. Our hearts are broken today, he said. As a country, we've been through this too many times. He did vow, there was one note of politics, slightly, vaguely, saying we're going to have to come together to prevent further accidents like this, further tragedies like this from ever happening again, regardless of the politics. But for the most part, he stayed away from that, talking about the need to for every parent to come together and hug their children a little tighter this evening. And of course, he said there would be families in Connecticut this evening that will not be able to do that. It was a very emotional address, without question, the most emotional I've ever seen him here at the White House. David?
I'd have to say the same thing, Jake, in watching him. He wiped away tears several times, and I was moved really by the same thing, Jake, when he pointed out that the majority of the victims in this school were children, and he said, as he addressed this nation, they were 5 to 10 years old, and they just had dreams of, many of them, what Santa would bring for Christmas, what they would celebrate with their family during Hanukkah in these recent days, making it through the end of these next couple of weeks so they could have that great and well-deserved Christmas and New Year's vacation. And as Jake points out, he said, Michelle and I will hug our own children, even though many in that region of the country, Newtown, Connecticut, will not be able to do the same with theirs. And one other thing he said, not a parent in America doesn't feel the same overwhelming feeling of grief, as he wiped one of those tears away. And as you look at these pictures, you can understand really how the president or anyone watching today, anyone who has children in their lives, to imagine that the children of this school walked out to this. Not only had they escaped the school under those kinds of circumstances, but they walked out to see tearful adults and cell phones, waiting to hear whether or not their children had survived. Authorities with guns drawn. We know that for quite some time after those initial calls that they were out searching not only the neighborhood surrounding the school, but going car to car looking inside those schools. We know that the teachers have been given one mission when that call came in, when that alert went out, and that was to get the children out into the firehouse around the corner. You can see that picture there, one of the adults taking children away, the children holding hands, and all of us watching with you at home in our studio here in New York with our monitors, taking in the same images you are, and moved by sort of the resiliency of these little faces. Many of them leaving all their stuff behind, being wrapped, one of them by a fireman in a blanket, the other children that we've seen wrapped in their parents' clothes who showed up, and they were the lucky parents who showed up and found their children were waiting at that firehouse, had to give them a hug and a coat, and now the difficult task, as Jen Ashton and Rich Besser have told us all morning long, of talking it through with your children, sensing where they are on this, and then that tricky balance, which is, not to overtalk it, but make sure that you've addressed it and let them know it's so rare, and reassure them that things will be normal again. The shots of authorities walking across that roof, we know they swooped in very quickly, began walking through the school, classroom to classroom. We heard earlier today that description. They checked every crack, every crevice in the school before they determined that they had secured the facility. We do know from Pierre Thomas's reporting a short time ago that not only are they investigating the horror inflicted at this scene that you're looking at here, but they're also at the scene of a home in New Jersey. It's believed to be the home of the gunman and his mother. What's not known is if Ryan Lanzette in fact still lived at that home, but we know he's 24 years old, obviously young and what would appear to be a very troubled young man. And the questions in the days that will follow will be all about the red flags and what could have been done, as we always do, come together as a nation to try to figure out how we can try to prevent this from happening again. One of the things about this story that moved us all is that this school tried to do what it could to try to beef up security earlier this year, actually sending out a letter to parents at home saying there'd be new security procedures in place. It was for this school year, in fact, a security system in all the elementary schools to ensure safety, they wrote. And this is what they wrote. They said every visitor will be required to ring the doorbell at the front entrance. Probably sounds like a school in your part of the country. Ring the doorbell. The office staff will use a visual monitoring system to allow entry. Visitors will still be required to report directly to the office and sign in. And if we don't recognize you, you'll be required to show your ID. Please understand that with nearly 700 students, over 1,000 parents representing 500 families, most parents will be asked to show ID. And you know, when you're in the heat of the moment trying to pick your kid up and you're running a bunch of errands, I'm sure that probably can seem like an inconvenience. But on a day like today, we can all understand the importance of going along with anything you can to try to make that school safer. And that's exactly what it appears the school tried to do. Dan Harris is at the school. And Dan, I'm not sure if you had your earpiece in, but I was just talking about how Sandy Hook actually implemented some additional security this school year alone. Not a school on lockdown, but you know, with a visual cue and having to report to the office and show an ID. And it would seem they were doing just about everything possible other than, you know, barricading the school, which we all know is just not reality in America today.
Right. I did hear you, and you're spot on. I mean, how much can you do, aside from turn schools into Fort Knox? How much can you do to block a deranged person who is heavily armed and intent on killing people? This school clearly took extra measures very recently to implement security. It's unclear, though, what more they could have done to prevent what transpired here today. We are standing in front of the volunteer firehouse where parents have been reuniting with their children all day. I should clarify, though, that when we came here several hours ago, what we were seeing were parents reuniting with their children, taking their children home, which was quite poignant. What we're seeing now is something much more disturbing, which is we're seeing one by one many families leaving, escorted by law enforcement officers, and these are families who do not have children with them. Now, obviously, we don't know their stories, but one can infer that at least some of these people are people who lost their children, perhaps today, in the little schoolhouse down this street. Hard to imagine a more wrenching circumstance, and then to have to walk out here in front of all these reporters and in front of all these law enforcement officers, some of them with tears in their eyes, some of them on cell phones, perhaps updating their families on what transpired here today. All of them escorted by law enforcement officers to their cars on their way home, to a home that will be quite empty from now on for more than for perhaps 24 families in this town here tonight.
Dan, really moved by the little girl that you interviewed. Her name was Alexis a short time ago in our coverage here on ABC News. And as you and I both know, some of the most honest people out there when we go out to do the stories every day in America are the children we interview. And when she told you, I just felt sick, I felt like I was going to be sick. And I thought, wow, that's probably how so many of those children felt. And what a brave little girl to share that with you today.
She was a brave girl, and that really was such a powerful thing she said about feeling sick. She knew in her gut that something very wrong had transpired in a classroom not far from hers. She described people screaming and crying. She said the screaming wasn't so bad, but there was a lot of crying. People knew that something was deeply amiss. It was also really striking to here, sorry, we're in a place with a lot of reporters here, so there are people walking back and forth in front of the camera. It was also striking to hear from Alexis's mom and to see how grateful she was to be with her child. Something else her mother said that really struck me was that she felt the need to pinch herself, and not in a good way, just to remind herself that this isn't a dream, it is in fact a living nightmare, that this has happened here in this small town of fewer than 30,000 people. As we've discussed throughout this day, David, one never expects something like this to happen anywhere, but this is a truly unlikely backdrop for this kind of horror. This is, as I said, a town of fewer than 30,000 people in southern New England, a beautiful place. known for having a town meeting house in the center of town, a historic place where the certain moments in the Revolutionary War and the Underground Railroad played out here. This is a town where their town symbol is a rooster. This is a quintessential New England town. A town, by the way, that I used to come visit when I was a kid because I had family here. A small town with lots of cul-de-sacs and happy families. To have this happen here is horrific.
Dan Harris, a New Englander himself, reporting on how unlikely they felt that they would be targeted by such horror in this little town today, under a clear sky on a chilly Friday morning, making it through another week of school and trying to get closer to that holiday. And Dan, we thank you for your reporting. It's one of the most difficult things to show up at one of those scenes and stand a respectful distance away, but try to inform really that community and the nation as a whole of what's transpiring. I did want to let our audience know it's now 3:30, obviously, here on the East Coast, and we continue to follow the shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, at an elementary school, Sandy Hook Elementary School. It's believed anywhere between 500, 700 kids go to school there every day. The number on your screen, and it's a number that will etch this day in history. At least 27 shot and killed. It makes it the deadliest day at an elementary school in this country. We have learned from Washington that the United States flag, will be flown at half-staff at the White House and upon all public buildings and grounds, at all military posts and naval stations, on all naval vessels of the federal government throughout the U.S. Until sunset on December the 18th. You can see the flag right there above the White House. And it comes just a short time, about 15 minutes ago, the president stood before this country and wiped away tears several times as he talked about enduring so many of these tragedies, that he reacts not as a president, but as a parent. And he surmised that not a parent in this country doesn't feel the same way he's feeling today. And he said that he and the First Lady, Michelle Obama, will embrace their little girls, and some of them not so little anymore. They're getting taller and taller every time we see them, but embracing them when they get home from school. He was visibly emotional. I think the most emotional I've seen him. Jake said the same thing, Jake Tapper, at the White House, as he prepares to start his second term, and they have worked so hard as a first family to shield their daughters from the public eye. And so I can only imagine seeing these little faces that are on national television today, through no fault of their own, through no choice of their own, thrust into the national spotlight because of the horrific scene that unfolded at their school today. I did want to bring in Pierre Thomas, who's been following developments at the White House. Pierre, we saw the flag flying at half-staff over the White House. We heard the president a short time ago. We also heard from him, it wasn't overt politics, but we did hear from him the need, because we report so often on these cases, that now someone will have to do something to try to keep this from happening again.
Well, David, it's fair to say that these types of shootings are becoming chronic, persistent. Just this year alone, you had the shooting at the Colorado movie theater. You had the shooting at the Sikh temple. Really, since Virginia Tech in 2007, we've had mass shootings like this on a pretty regular basis in which 3 or more people have been killed. And we're talking literally hundreds of people. So I think the president was getting at the notion of whether there's going to be additional gun control measures. There's been a spike in gun sales in the last month or so. In fact, the day after Thanksgiving, the FBI recorded the most background checks ever in the history of the country in terms of handgun sales and rifle sales. And many people think that's because people were concerned that additional gun control measures are coming.
Yeah, and so many people just want to find common ground on this issue in this country, feeling so strongly about the right to bear arms, but at the same time, the right as a parent to protect these schools.
And David?
Yeah, go ahead, Pierre.
One thing I would add is that, look, this is a very complicated problem. There are some estimates that there are over 300 million guns already in circulation. So if you stop selling them tomorrow, this problem would not go away. As one source told me, guns are not biodegradable, so this problem will be with us. But again, with the situation developing where every few weeks, every few months, having mass shootings where people are in what they call soft targets, where the shooters go to places where there's likely to be little security, likely to be lots of people in a concentrated fashion, and mow them down. This is a question that the country, it seems, is going to have to address at some point.
Yeah, not only a question we'll have to address, but a conversation, Pierre, as you point out, that's already started. We just got this from Mark Kelly, of course, the astronaut, the commander, the husband of Gabrielle Giffords, the congresswoman who was shot in Tucson. And he writes on Facebook that this time our response must consist of more than regret, more than sorrow, more than condolences. The children of Sandy Hook Elementary School and all the victims of gun violence deserve leaders who have the courage to participate in the meaningful discussion about our gun laws. So there will be some pressure to address this without infringing upon the rights of the other Americans who, of course, feel so strongly about protecting those rights. So it's a very careful debate that will ensue in the days and weeks to come. But we want to go to Governor Dan Malloy in Connecticut there, addressing the nation now.
Lieutenant Governor and I have been spoken to in an attempt that we might be prepared for something like this playing itself out in our state. You can never be prepared for this kind of incident. What has happened, what has transpired at that school building will leave a mark on this community and every family impacted. I only ask that all of our fellow citizens here in the United States and around the world who have already offered their assistance remember all of the victims in their prayers. To all of you on the media, we will do our best to keep you as informed as we can. After I'm done speaking, a representative of the state police will speak to you and give you some additional information. Earlier today, a number of our citizens, beautiful children, had their life taken away from them, as well as adults whose responsibility it was to educate and supervise those children. The perpetrator of the crime is dead, as is an individual who the perpetrator lived with. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul Vance, who will answer or will give you some additional information, and then later in the day, perhaps we'll speak again. Again, I think on behalf of the people of the state of Connecticut, we extend our condolences, as I have at the firehouse, to the parents of these children, as well as the adults that are there. I want to thank the president, who has been on the phone with us today for his statement released to you a little while ago, as well as the statements he made to me much earlier today as the hours race by. And with that, I should also say that there are a number of public officials, including the First Select Woman, who has been on site throughout the day. We have state representatives, state senator, other select people who are here. We have the superintendent of schools who has done wonderful work in helping us get the information necessary to begin the processes that will be ongoing for a number of hours in advance. I want to thank Senator Blumenthal and Senator-elect Murphy for also joining us. With that, I'm going to absent myself. Mr. Vance will come forward and speak to you. Thank you very much.
Hi, good evening. I just would like to restate some of the information that we made available earlier. We'll take some questions, but I must preface my remarks by saying this is an active, ongoing investigation. There is a great deal of work to go, and there is a lot of things that we cannot confirm or discuss as of yet. But shortly after 9:30 this morning, Newtown Police Department received a call for help at the Sandy Hook Elementary School here in Newtown. Upon realizing the intensity and the difficulty of the situation, Newtown called for surrounding police departments and state police to respond to assist. Upon arrival of law enforcement officers at the school, they immediately entered the school as we knew this was an potential active shooter situation. Their focus was to search for students, faculty, and staff and remove them to a safe area outside of the school. They did search every nook and cranny, every room, and every portion of that school and accomplished that task. They took the rescue to a staging area to reunite them with family members. As has been reported, there were fatalities. There were 18 children that were pronounced dead at the school. There were 2 that were transported to area hospitals and pronounced dead at area hospitals. And there were 6 adults pronounced dead at the scene at the school. As the governor has reported, the shooter is deceased. Is deceased in the school. There's a great deal of work going on relative to that. That's the reason we have not identified him as of yet. And by that I mean search warrants, examination of areas of residence, employment, and any ancillary things that may be attached to the identity and to that individual. The scene has been secured. Newtown police officers, state police major crime units from both Western District and Central District have responded and are working with several agencies to process this scene. It is not a simplistic scene, as you can certainly understand. We need to establish identity, we need to document the entire scene, and simply stated, we need to answer every single question surrounding exactly how and why this incident occurred. As the governor said, we will be here through the night, certainly through the weekend, and we're not even putting a time stamp on this as to when we will complete this project. We'll work with the medical examiner's office. We have to establish positive identification. And again, there's a great deal of work that needs to be done here at the school. And we'll take some very brief questions, but understand that this is an active, ongoing case, and there are many things that we cannot and will not discuss at this time. Yes, sir.
We're told that there are 2 other crime scenes, including the suspect's father's home in New Jersey and his mother's home here in Newtown.
There is a secondary crime scene here in Newtown. That is in fact correct. There is an adult deceased at that location. I can't discuss any further information on that at this time. There is assistance being lended to us by New Jersey. I don't have the details on that, so I can't answer that. I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am. Okay, I can simply state that the information that we have right now that we want to publicize that the shootings did take place in one section of the school in 2 rooms. Okay, 1 section in 2 rooms. That's as much as we want to go in right now as far as location. Our personnel are documenting that entire scene, and we'll have literally everything mapped out in the final report, final information. We'll present the answers to those questions. But right now, I don't have any more detail than that. Okay. You had a question, sir. Someone. Right now, there is 1 shooter, but again, we're still looking at every ancillary fact and circumstance related to the deceased shooter at the scene. Yes, sir.
Any specifics on the weapons used?
No, I don't have that information. I'm sorry. To be determined. I don't have the answer to that question either. The next step will be the medical examiner's office will certainly assist us in answering a lot of those questions, the manner and cause of death of all of the deceased.
How many injured?
That's it. 26 deceased.
No injuries?
1 injury. 1 person was injured. Yes. I'm sorry? They're in 1 section or 1 area of the school. That's the best I can do on that answer. I don't know specifically how many rooms were involved. I was told that there were 2, but in 1 section of the school building.
And then with the adults, were they other?
Everyone was in that same section of the building.
Was that being recorded?
Not to be determined, sir. A section of the building is as far as we want to go.
Did you already say how the shooter died?
We did not. We did not. That's to be determined once the postmortem examinations are complete.
Does 26 include the shooter as well?
I'm sorry?
Does 26 include the shooter?
20 children, 6 adults, and the shooter. 27 total. That's correct.
20 children?
And the one at the house. That's correct. That's at the school itself. And then there's 1 more, as we just said, at a secondary crime scene. There's a deceased adult at the secondary crime scene. Yes, ma'am. To be determined. That's really something that our investigators are going to have to look at thoroughly and completely, and that'll take some time to try and answer that question. We haven't established any of that, ma'am. We have not made any positive identifications. We're working on that. There's some preliminary identifications been made, but we have as I said, a great deal of work. That's one thing we have to do, is establish positive identification on all the deceased, and that's a time-consuming process.
Lieutenant, do we know the ages of the victims? The ages, the range, the age range?
I don't. No, I don't. This is a K through 4 elementary school.
And when
Okay.
police went into the school, were there still shots being fired at that time?
That I don't know. I don't know the time sequence, and that'll be something that we will provide you. What I'd like to do is, no, we did not. What I'd like to do then is tell you that this is a briefing. We'll be back in 60 minutes. Myself and the lieutenant from Newtown will be back in 60 minutes. We'll see if there's any more detail. I've got some of the questions that you've posed. I'll see if I can get some more answers to provide you with information, and that will be just about 20 of 5, quarter to 5.
Was the shooter's mother a teacher?
That I don't know.
It's 20 children, 6 adults in the shooter. Is that correct?
20 children, 6 adults in the facility, plus the shooter. That's 27, and then a secondary scene with an additional adult victim at that secondary scene.
28 is
Okay.
28.
Okay.
You said quarter to 5?
Yeah, about 20 of quarter to 5 will be.
Do you have an age range on the children?
I do not. I do not.
Lieutenant,
Yeah. One thing I would like to say is that we've been meeting with all of the family members. It's a very, very difficult scene for the family members, for all the responding first responders. It's a tragedy. It's a tragic scene. We've been asked by the family members to ask the members of the press to respect their privacy and to please leave them alone at this time. They're going through a tremendous amount of grief, which I'm sure you can appreciate. So I've been asked to ask you that personally by the family members. All right. I'll be back in 60 minutes with the lieutenant. We'll answer any additional questions we can. I don't know. I
Lieutenant Paul Vance of the Connecticut State Police there in Newtown, Connecticut. This is David Muir in New York, and you're watching continuing coverage here on ABC News of this tragedy that's unfolded in Connecticut at Sandy Hook Elementary School. We've been on the air for hours now with you all, and he just provided some new information, and the numbers really are staggering when you break them down. As we all know, this was an elementary school. It's going to be in the history books because this is the deadliest day ever at an elementary school in this country. 18 children, 2 areas of the school. We do believe that 6 adults are among the dead. That would bring the total to 26 dead, and then the gunman. So that's where the number 27 comes from inside the school. So 18 children, 6 adults, and the gunman. And we do believe, according to the lieutenant there moments ago, that there's an additional adult who is deceased at a separate location in Newtown, he said, right there in that community. Another adult, he would not say the relationship to the suspect, though we do believe that there was a relationship at the school. The mother, in fact, a teacher at the school, teaching kindergarten, it's been the belief. The school is K through 4, and again, he pointed out that it was in 2 rooms of the school, one particular section of the school, 18 children. 18 children, 6 adults in that school. And then what he didn't make clear is whether or not the gunman, the suspect, then took their own life, or whether or not authorities had actually entered the school at that point. He said he simply did not know the answer to that question. He promised, of course, to come back in front of reporters in an hour to provide more, and we'll bring that to you just as soon as we can. I want to bring in our senior justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, who's been ahead of this every step of the way today for us, Pierre, and he helped paint the picture inside that school.
Well, David, the situation is still very fluid. We're getting additional information. Federal law enforcement sources were initially given the name of Ryan Lanza, 24, as being the shooter. But we're being told by those same sources that there's some confusion now. The shooter may in fact be his brother, Adam Lanza. So we're trying to get that cleared up as we speak. Law enforcement officials say, again, it's a very fluid situation, and obviously the shooter is dead, and they're trying to confirm all the information that they have.
Thank you, Pierre, and I'd be remiss if I didn't point out the 2 children who were taken to area hospitals and who died at the hospital. As you remember earlier in our coverage, we reported 3 people had been rushed to the hospital, and now we've learned that 2 of them were children, and they did not survive this. So it's 18 children in the school, 2 children at the hospital, 6 adults at the school, and the gunman. And what we're trying to learn at this hour is the other adult who is deceased as well at a separate location, a second location where authorities are right now investigating, and we'll bring that to you just as soon as it comes in. I want to go to a moment that we had earlier that I was moved by, and I'm sure if you've been with us throughout the day that you were too. It's the little boy, his little short hair, and what he felt, what he saw, what he said. when he was one of the students to get out of that school, and he turned on both sides of him and saw his friends had made it out too. Here he is.
There's a man pinned down to the ground with handcuffs on, and we thought that was the victim. We really didn't get a good glance at him because he was, like, there's a car blocking it, plus we were running really quick. So then we got to the firehouse and we sat in our classes, and we were all really happy that we're all alive.
It was terrifying. I'm still terrified. I think I'm still in shock about it all. I still don't know everything that happened. I know that there are some people missing, that they've been taken to the hospital. I don't know if everyone's been accounted for. It's terrifying. You're rushing over here and you can't get to where you need to go, and you have to park down here and walk. I'm glad that my son is okay. He seems to be handling it actually pretty good right now. I know my son's teachers have been okay as well, but I've heard other teachers are not okay.
Are there parents that don't know what's going on, that their kids are unaccounted for when you went to go pick them up?
There were a few. They actually found, I think they just found one. There was a big cheer that went up that they had found someone, and they just may have been not at the firehouse, somewhere else.
The numbers are, it might be up to 18 kids and 27 people.
Gets us every time we see that father put his hand to his face, standing next to his brave little boy just to the side of him, who said he was just glad his friends got out too. I have new information to bring along to you, which helps to add to what we heard from Lieutenant Paul Vance there a moment ago about what was happening inside that school. It's believed that he said in 2 rooms, one section of the school, and it's believed that mother, the connection to the suspect, obviously, who went in to that school today, she was found dead. It's believed, and this is confirmed with our sources at the Department of Justice, that she was a kindergarten teacher and that many of the students who were killed were in class with her. So she was killed. It's believed many of her students were killed. According to multiple sources, the gunman was also a student who grew up and went to that school. So we'll be learning more about the dynamics of this family, what possibly could have led to this. But that is going to be one of the classrooms where we hear about the extraordinary horror of a teacher, a kindergarten teacher, and about the students inside that class, and the parents who met with Governor Malloy. And you heard the lieutenant there say, Paul Vance say, that this meeting with the family members was extraordinarily difficult, that this is a tragic scene. And we can only imagine as we sit here at a desk in New York about 45 minutes away as that all unfolds. I do know that my colleague Chris Cuomo, the anchor of 2020, is in the region as well. I believe he's in Shady Brook, which is a neighboring community. And Chris, what can you report?
Well, Shady Brook is where this community that goes to this town in Newtown is from. It's a very small place, and we've been today in a home that has been filled with people who don't know if their kids have made it, who find out that their kids are okay from their spouses who are down there in the thick of the chaos trying to find them. And the phrase that we heard that really resonated was that this was soul-shattering, what has happened here. What we're going to learn about Lonzo will wind up being painfully familiar to us, David. People who become deranged and they hatch a plot and then they carry out this type of madness. But what has really distinguished us, what we're reacting to, is who the victims were. These kids were so young. There's so many young kids involved, and we've been talking to them today. The blessing for them is their innocence, that they don't really know the monster that was in their midst. They were told to close their eyes when they were running out so they didn't have to see the carnage that was around them. But what they do remember are the teachers who, when they heard gunfire, David, put these kids in protected places, stayed their ground, and told them stories, played games. In the midst of this madness that they were hearing, they kept their cool and they got their kids out. And in a situation that is almost unbelievably horrible, it is amazing what these teachers did in those moments to get these kids out. It is one of those situations where, as terrible as it is, and it is almost unmitigatable in its horror, it could have been worse with the weaponry and ammunition Pierre's been telling us about that was brought by Lanza to the school. But to look into these little kids' eyes and hear them tell you what they heard, that they didn't was, and that they were taken to safety really brings home how horrible this was because of who was targeted. And it's a day that this community is never going to forget. So close to Christmas, this little girl, Ella, first grade, like my son Mario, just told me that she went to school this morning worried about a Christmas list. Was it too long? And then just a few minutes after she arrived, her day became what we now know is one of the worst in our country's history.
That's the thing, Chris. You know, so many of these children were hoping just to get through these last couple of weeks from school with that internal countdown in their head, knowing just how many days until Santa arrives and you drive that point home. We heard, I'm not sure if you were with us earlier, Chris, but we talked about a first grade teacher, and we're going to hear about so many of these teachers who turn out to be just extraordinarily brave individuals who should be applauded for their work every day in classrooms across America, but particularly on a day like today, who told reporters at the scene that the kids were being so good, they simply asked, can we go see if anyone else is out there? They were worried about their friends. And one student said, I just want Christmas. I don't want to die. I just want to have Christmas. And that first grade teacher responded, you're going to have Christmas and Hanukkah. And she said, I was just determined to stay positive, as she locked her kids in that bathroom, that first grade bathroom, and then they got out. As the details emerge, we can tell you that the weapons the gunman used included a Glock semi-automatic handgun, a semi-automatic handgun, in addition to what law enforcement authorities also tell us were .223 caliber shell casings, a rifle caliber also found at the scene. We believe that the total at this point were four weapons that gunman brought into the school, and we now know went to two classrooms in one section of the school. We know that one of the classrooms, it's believed his mother is a kindergarten teacher, and it was her classroom, that she did not survive this, nor did many of the students inside that classroom. And we have made this point over and over again as we've been on the air with you throughout the day here today, is that, you know, when these things unfold in these schools across America, that you walk down the hallway and there's a doorway into a classroom, and if there's somebody evil in that doorway, there is little a teacher can do to help shield her children or his children from getting in the way of that gunman. And so I want to bring in Dr. Jen Ashton with our medical team, who's with me on the desk. And when we learn about that she was a kindergarten teacher, that these were 5-year-olds in that classroom, and that this suspect would appear at the door, it's just chilling.
It's there are no words to describe what must have been going on so many different levels. You know, as a parent, what the fear and confusion that the children were experiencing, what the teacher was experiencing, the mental illness that the shooter, by definition, was experiencing, and then the shock waves, literally, that go out from that point, that ground zero on, and literally at this point now, I think it's safe to say, are being felt throughout the world, which is how something like this could happen. And the answer is, David, and we've seen it unfortunately so many times before, but this is the face of mental illness. And unfortunately at this time we have so many innocent victims, but oftentimes that's exactly what we have, is innocent victims.
What do we say to our children tonight, Jen?
You know, I'm trying to think about what I'm going to say to my own children. I think that the first and most paramount task of any parent is to reassure their children that they are safe. You want the conversation to be age appropriate. Obviously, the conversation that you'll have with a 5-year-old will be very different than the conversation you'll have with a 15-year-old. I think that it's very important for parents to explain to their children that sometimes bad things happen, but as we've heard many people and many mental health professionals say, fortunately, it's not that common. And then I think it's very important for parents and children to express their feelings, to say, I'm sad, I'm afraid, it's okay if you feel the same way. And from that point on, David, I think it's critically important for parents to involve mental health professionals as early as possible. There are highly trained and skilled grief counselors, social workers, psychologists, psychotherapists, psychiatrists, clergy. These people are highly trained in how to talk to children at various ages to get them through this kind of trauma. But make no mistake, this is a profound trauma, not just for those children in that school, obviously, but for children everywhere.
everywhere who are watching these images, and as we know in this day and age, it's not even just network television, it's the internet, and there's just really no escaping it, although we've asked parents obviously to flip the channel or move the kids elsewhere in the house as they watch this unfold here this afternoon. Another parent front and center today was the President Obama, speaking from the White House, and as is so often the case, he was most emotional in talking about an incident here in America, given the fact that he is a father himself, Sasha and Malia, and we all know that the President and the First Lady have worked to keep their family, to shield their own daughters from the public cameras. And so to look at those images today and see the fear on those faces, to hear about the kindergarten teacher and those kindergartners in that classroom, 5 years old, sitting there, just beginning their day, hoping to get through to Christmas. And it would certainly help explain why we saw what we believe to be perhaps one of the most emotional moments from our President as he tried to console the nation. Here he is.
This evening, Michelle and I will do what I know every parent in America will do, which is hug our children a little tighter, and we'll tell them that we love them, and we'll remind each other how deeply we love one another. But there are families in Connecticut who cannot do that tonight, and they need all of us right now. In the hard days to come, that community needs us to be at our best as Americans, and I will do everything in my power as president to help. Because while nothing can fill the space of a lost child or loved one, all of us can extend a hand to those in need, to remind them that we are there for them, that we are praying for them, that the love they felt for those they lost endures not just in their memories, but also in ours. May God bless the memory of the victims. And in the words of Scripture, heal the brokenhearted and bind up their wounds.
The President speaking at the White House just a short time ago, about 45 minutes ago. It's now just a couple of minutes past 4 o'clock Eastern Time, and we plan to take you through the next hour here on ABC News. Many of you will then join your local news covering this horrific, what's become a national tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut. Of course, at that school, Sandy Hook Elementary School, it began unfolding shortly after 9:30 this morning. We know at least 27 people are dead, and just moments ago, the Connecticut State Police helped to describe the scene inside the school. You can see there on the screen the shooter, it's believed the suspect's mother was that kindergarten teacher, that was one of 2 rooms, presumably 2 classrooms, that her kindergarten class was one of them. She didn't survive it, nor did many of the students inside that classroom. You can only imagine the horror inside that classroom. He was described as wearing a vest, that he had walked in with at least 4 weapons. There was one mother who said he was masked, although we will not know that, of course, until the hours that follow here when we get a slightly better description, though it's already horrific enough. That he stood at the doorway, and we don't know if he actually entered the classroom. But here are the numbers as they were laid out just moments ago by Connecticut authorities, that there were 18 children who died at the scene. 18, unfathomable. 2 children were then rushed to area hospitals. They'd been shot as well and then died at area hospitals. So that brings you to 20 children who were killed today at that elementary school in Connecticut. 6 adults also killed at the scene. That brings you to 26, and we've been hearing that number at least 27 all day, and that's where we get to the additional adult at another scene there in Newtown, Connecticut. They wouldn't tell us what the scene is or perhaps the relationship with that additional adult. So at least 27 people dead. And then you add the gunman, and what's not clear, authorities making it clear to all of us in that press conference just moments ago, they don't know whether or not at this point he took his own life or whether authorities had already arrived at the scene. And as we learn more about this particular suspect, you heard Jen Ashton say here a moment ago on the desk that this is mental illness. And there's a lot of talk about gun control in this country, but there will be a lot of talk about mental illness, how we reach out to people who need help earlier, much earlier than something like this can then unfold. And I wanted to bring in Brad Garrett, an FBI profiler. He's an ABC News analyst, and we turn to Brad in times like these to try to wrap our heads around why someone could be capable of this and how we wouldn't see it earlier to try to help prevent it. But Brad, how does a 24-year-old walk into his own mother's classroom, if that is indeed the case, with children beginning their school day, kindergartners, and perform such a heinous act?
Well, David, this is probably built up over a number of years, I would guess. And when you look at the profile of mass shooters, it's like their life never went together. That they had problems when they were a child. They had problems with adult relationships, whether they be a female, a wife, a parent, and these things tend to build. Now, a lot of the times they cause the problem, but they perceive it as it's our fault that they are failing at things that they are doing. And so as they reach, unfortunately, their late teens or early 20s, there is this period where they believe that they have to empower themselves. And as odd as this sounds, they think they have the right to go out and destroy everything that they believe has wronged them. And I think the reason he went to the school, obviously to shoot perhaps mom, but to all of her kids, is that those kids are associated with her. And I'm going to bet that the other scene is a relative, a brother, a father, somebody else that he believed he needed to wipe off the earth because they had wronged him.
Chilling when you put it that way, and you're the profiler. I hate to typecast, but you look back at these shootings, Aurora, I was there earlier this year in Colorado for that, Virginia Tech, Columbine, and you see this pattern of young white males, and perhaps you can shed a little light on why that builds into this profile.
Well, the male part I understand, and I think the age range we just talked about, 18 to early 20s, sometimes up to 30, seems to be where it falls. But I also think, David, this has something to do with how males in general deal with stress, failure, anger, and rage. Where females tend to internalize it, males tend to externalize it. And if you combine that with how males typically are socialized to be more aggressive, that it makes it easier, I suppose, for a male to go and commit such a horrendous act. And if we look historically about how people kill each other, males tend to do it much more in a violent fashion, and unfortunately in a mass fashion like we have today.
And the extraordinary thing is that this particular family is dealing with horrific loss too, and we often find that in these cases. The mother is dead, the kindergarten teacher. We don't know who this second adult is at this second scene in Newtown, Connecticut. But as is so often the case, the families say afterward that they too feel and pray for the victims of these tragedies. But when we go back and look, Jen Ashton, part of our medical unit here on the desk, and Dr. Ashton, when you look back, there are often warning signs along the way, and nobody's saying, well, why didn't you do this, why didn't you do that? But we have to, as a nation, look for these warning signs.
Well, they're warning signs, David, that are only clear in hindsight, of course. And when you look again at the profile of an acute psychotic break, because that's what this is, when you talk about mental illness, we're talking here, by definition, of a situation or a state known as acute psychosis, which means there is an impairment of reality and judgment. When you look at people who suffer acute psychosis, typically you're talking about people who may have paranoid schizophrenia, who may have an extreme or manic form of bipolar disorder, and possibly, as we just heard, a history of either psychological or physical trauma or abuse in the past. As to whether or not those warning signs, as we're going to be talking so much about in the upcoming days, have been apparent, again, maybe in hindsight, yes. But looking forward, a lot of people can have their moments where they behave erratically. It's only when you put those as a sum total and then make a whole timeline over a course of someone's life, then do you start to connect the pieces. In times, yes, there can be glaring warning signs. People who withdraw from their job, withdraw from their family, who have a history of abusing animals, who have a history of violence or violent thoughts or hearing voices. But sometimes those things are not apparent.
And so many of these issues came up in the Aurora, Colorado shooting, the Batman movie, of course, and we then saw the suspect in court with the hair, that sort of fire engine, red, orange, and there were signs in that case too as that continues to unfold.
Right, and it's important for people to understand when you talk about this condition of acute psychosis that a crime, a heinous act like this can be premeditated and can be methodically executed in someone who is acutely psychotic. That's where the mental illness comes in.
We'll be talking about that in the days to come, and of course there's always that debate about giving a suspect in any of these cases any more attention than they deserve, but we obviously do it to try to prevent it from happening again. I want to turn to your teammate, Dr. Rich Besser, who's at the scene now, and the most important people to focus on tonight, of course, and this afternoon and into the weekend are those children who were shuttled out of that school today, and what to say to them. And Rich, you're a dad too, so the question for you tonight is, what will you say to your own children?
You know, that's a tough one, David, and you know, everyone knows their own child best. So you really want to deal with them based on their age and their own personality. Very young children who are in elementary school or younger, if it's possible to shield them from this so they don't even know about it, that's the best approach. If they're a little older than that, if they're elementary school up to middle school, you want them to be able to talk to you about what they're feeling. You want to be able to talk to them in clear language about what you're feeling. But overall, you want to give them that sense that they are safe, that this was a bad man who did this. This was someone who wasn't well, and he's not around anymore. The police did their job. That will give them that feeling of security. Hugs, physical contact can be very, very important to communicating that sense of well-being. When you're looking at older kids, I have teenagers. My kids, they want to talk about this. Why did this happen? How could it have been prevented? What can they do in their lives right now to take charge to make sure that these things don't keep happening so often? And so understanding your child, letting them talk, letting them know that you're feeling bad about this, that you're feeling sad, that you're angry, those things are all very important to do during this phase.
Rich, thanks so much, and I know you're there on the scene. Have you had a chance to talk with any of these families to hear how this community is dealing with this? We know it initially, began at that 9:30 call that went into authorities, and then that sort of that technological sign of the times, that text alert that went out saying to pick up your children at that firehouse, which was just around the corner from the elementary school. And in the beginning, what was early reported was that parents didn't actually know which school they were talking about. You can only imagine the fear that strikes in any parent. But I'm just curious if you've been able to talk to any members of that community. They've been described as close-knit, and they likely all know each other and are pulling together already. But what have you seen?
I haven't had a chance to talk to anyone yet, David. The police have barricaded off that area. There are long lines of people who are trying to get close. I don't know how many of them are family and how many of them are media. But these are the sort of events that do pull communities closer together. This is the time when you need to reach out to your friends, to your neighborhood, to your neighbors, and to those people who may be alone, and make sure that they're being well cared for, and that they have someone who is giving them the emotional support that you are giving your own family.
And Rich, for the students there at Sandy Hook, this is a K-4 school. It's an elementary school. We know 2 of the rooms targeted. One of them was a kindergarten class. In many cases, they just shut down the school for a couple of weeks, so we certainly don't know if they'll even have class now for what was going to be their Christmas holiday and their New Year's holiday in just a couple of weeks' time. But how do you convince the students at this school, students across the country, but in particular at this school, that when they go back, that their classroom, that their hallways are safe?
That's a great question, and I think they're going to look for some expert opinion about when to let children back into this school. When you look at countries that face a lot of terrorism, one of the things that they try and do right away is to normalize the situation and remove any sign of the event that took place. We haven't been inside this school, and there hasn't been a lot of information about that. But the more they can do to make that area look normal, so that when kids eventually go back into that school, it looks like they remembered it as a safe place, that will be very important in terms of healing.
Rich Besser there on the scene in Newtown, Connecticut. Dr. Richard Besser will be checking in with you, I'm sure, throughout our coverage. We should tell our viewers who are joining us about 15 minutes past 4 o'clock now Eastern Time that my friend, colleague Diane Sawyer will be anchoring from the scene a 1-hour edition of World News. She's been on the scene for much of the day and talked with parents earlier who described just a chaotic scene when they got there. Some of the teachers very calmly telling children to cover their eyes as they were walking out. And in fact, one of the images that struck me was the father who held his own hand, his own arm over his son's eye, doing the shielding for him. And on your screen, just a quick look at our programs. We'll be covering this obviously throughout the evening. World News, of course, with Diane 2020 Nightline tonight, and really through the night, and GMA first thing in the morning. And we're going to take you right through the afternoon here. We're not going to leave you as we continue to get developments. For those of you who have to leave the TV at .com, abcnews.com, you can find the latest developments. But I want to bring you up to speed on what we've learned. You've been with us probably for some time now. The portrait of the school is the clearest that we've had yet since this tragedy began unfolding this morning. And as we look back to images of that scene, here's what we know. We know 18 children died inside that school. There were 2 rooms, it's believed, the suspect actually targeted. One of them was a kindergarten class where his mother was the teacher. 2 of the children who'd been shot, they'd hoped to be able to save. We saw those images of the ambulances going to the school. They rushed the 2 children to an area hospital, and they too died at the hospital, we are told. You can see the anguish on these faces here as we go down the list and the numbers here. 6 adults were also killed at the scene. So it's 18 children, 6 adults, 2 additional children at the local hospital. And then what we don't know, and we're waiting for more reporting from our justice team led by Pierre Thomas, is the additional scene where we believe from Lieutenant Paul Vance of Connecticut State Police that there is one more scene in Newtown, Connecticut, where authorities continue to investigate that there's an additional adult who has died at that scene, but they were very reluctant to offer any more details because of how early we are in the investigation. This little boy here and the mother, the anguish, and one of the things that we've talked about here, Jen, is that the children themselves walking single file out of that school, one of the very early reports as we were sitting here on the desk was from someone on the scene who said they could hear the cries, a little bit of whimpering, but there was no screaming. The children did exactly what they were told, that the real emotion came from the adults and the teenagers at the middle, the high school, who were worried about their own younger siblings at the school because they had a better grasp of sort of the horror that was unfolding, and you can kind of see in the difference between the reactions.
Yeah, and you know what really strikes me, David, as we see those images, which are so distressing, the parents, as stressed and upset and concerned as they all certainly appear to be, they're doing their jobs, and their jobs is to try and find their children and to try and protect their children and to try to remove their children from that scene. That's what the teachers did. That's what the faculty's task is. To some extent, that's what the first responders tried to do after the scene was as secured as possible. But make no mistake about it, David, just as we'll see this from the children, we'll also expect and see from the adults, from the parents who were at the scene, even from the first responders, once they're alone and they know their children are safe, this will take its toll on them. There's no question. Yeah. I mean, it's impossible not to.
Once it settles in, you've got to hand it to the bravery of those teachers who kept those kids focused on the sole purpose, the sole task at hand, which was to get out of that school and to get to the firehouse right around the corner. I wanted to play for you a mother and a daughter who Dan Harris spoke to a short time ago. She was one of the little girls in the school who got out, and her bravery was really something. She talked about the emotion and quite frankly about how she felt on the inside. Here's Dan's moment with that mother and daughter.
You were in there, Alexis?
Yes.
What happened?
Nothing really much. We heard like an ambulance and a police officer come, and everybody was a little scared, crying, and I felt actually a little sick, and I felt like I was gonna throw up, and I felt that to my teacher too.
How did you get out of there?
We had to go through the building, and then we had to just go to the firehouse.
And did you know what was happening at the time?
No, until our next door neighbor, Mrs. Walker, which is one of our friends, and then she said that like there's a lockdown, you guys just gotta be calm, and then her class came into our room, and then we just do that. So.
Were kids crying and screaming?
Yeah, kids were crying, not really like screaming, but they're all huddling together, and they felt so sick.
And how old are you?
8.
You're 8 years old. And what's your name again?
Alexis.
What's your last name?
Wasik.
How do I spell that?
Wasik.
And you're in 4th grade? 3rd grade. 3rd grade. How did you find out about this?
They actually have an alert system through the school, and so they sent a message saying something. I don't even remember the message. Something about lockdown, and So I figured it was, honestly, I figured fries were the high school. And little did I know that it was actually here. So I actually called my husband and said, can you go find out what are they talking about? And he goes, get in the car and drive. Go get her to school. I'll meet you at the school. So he got here and I got here, and he had her in his arms, and and I'm crying, and so she just goes, Mama, I'm okay, I'm here. But it just doesn't even seem real. I mean, I'm still like, really? I mean, here in Newtown, in this small town, and you read about this everywhere else but here, and it's heart-wrenching for the children and for the parents and grandparents and everybody. I can't even fathom. It just doesn't even seem real. It's like, should I be pinched to see if it really is real? And it's just heart-wrenching.
Feels like a dream, and a bad dream.
It's a nightmare. It feels like a nightmare, and you just never in a million years would you ever think, you drop your child off at school, hugs and kisses, have a good day, I'll see you later, and see you at the end of the day. And you never know, are you still going to have, in 20 minutes from now, what's going to happen? And you count your blessings every day for what you have.
Alexis, I'm really glad you're okay. I'm really glad you're okay. You're pretty tough.
We are too.
You're pretty tough.
We are too.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to...
Very tough. That mother saying, counting your blessings, and we'll all be doing that across this country and hugging our children tonight when they get home from school. As this has become a national tragedy, there are images already from the White House tonight. They have said that flags will be lowered to half staff at government buildings across this country, at federal buildings. We saw a very emotional President Obama about an hour ago, the most emotional, quite frankly, that we've seen him as president, and not surprisingly, given how often he's talked about his role as a dad being equally as important, if not more, than his role as the president. And you see the flag there flying at half staff. This is going to be a tough story to get through over the next couple of days. We're going to swing through all of our reporters working this, and let's begin with Dan Harris at the scene. And Dan, there would seem to be a couple of outstanding issues that we don't know the answers to yet, and forgive me for putting you on the spot, we probably still don't know, but it's unclear when the gunman was in the building whether or not authorities actually got to him or whether he took his own life. And what do we know about the second scene there in Newtown? The Connecticut State Police talking about there being a second scene with another adult, but we're reluctant to add anything more, and I'm wondering if you've heard anything there on the ground.
I think you've put your finger on the two huge outstanding questions. I would add a third, which is, what was the motive of the alleged shooter? Why would he do this? It may, as often is the case in these stories that you and I have covered so frequently, David, in the last couple of years, the motive is often deeply unsatisfying and illogical, but we still do not know that. As to the questions you raised, was he killed by police officers, or did he do the deed himself? We should know more soon on that when police hold a news conference. They were, as you said, reluctant to say. We just don't know at this point. We do know that there was an enormous response here. Here in this woodsy little neighborhood called Sandy Hook, which is part of Newtown, so named for a sort of bend in the river that runs through this neighborhood, a sandy bend in the river. In this neighborhood, we've had this stark juxtaposition today of having all of these tactical team officers, people in full armor with their long guns drawn. They responded in a massive way when the reports came in of this school shooting. So it's unclear whether they took the shooter's life or whether he, as I said, did the deed himself. And the other question, of course, is there is a second crime scene here tonight. There is another body present at another location. We believe is, as you said, an adult. Police still working that scene, and we hope to have answers on both of those fronts in the not too distant future when the police hold another briefing.
Dan, I can see the emergency trucks there behind you. You've been there on the scene really for hours since this morning when the first call came into the newsroom. And one of the striking things that we learned from this press conference a short time ago is that, well, first of all, we believe only 3 people were taken to area hospitals. And now we've learned that 2 of them were children who did not survive. So one of the really stark things about this particular school shooting is the fact that so few people had a chance to get out of that school. So few students and teachers who were targeted even had a chance, were carried out by those ambulances.
Right. And you know, one of the sad things that we've seen here today, among many, many sad things, and you and I have discussed this, David, is to see ambulances leaving the scene here driving slowly, their lights not flashing. They would much rather, one has to imagine, have in their cargo load patients who need to be treated. But the fact of the matter here is this shooter was all too successful, and he was able to take out a lot of very young people, as the president called them, beautiful children. And it's an incredibly sad fact. Only 3 people taken to the hospital. We know 2 of them children, and both of them unfortunately deceased. You mentioned this place where I'm standing. This is the local firehouse. It's just up the street just a little bit from Sandy Hook Elementary School. And this is kind of the emotional epicenter of this story, because this is where parents were told to come to pick up their children. So all day long, we've been watching these astonishingly emotional reunions. You saw the parent and child, Alexis and her mom, speaking earlier about what it was like to finally be reunited after this scare. What we've also seen are the parents who are not going to be reunited. 20 parents, 20 families shattered by what happened at the little school right down this bucolic little road here today. And this little town is now, as you've pointed out, David, in the history books for all the wrong reasons.
All right, Dan Harris with us all day long, and we'll see you again shortly. Dan, our thanks to you. I want to bring in Pierre Thomas, our senior justice correspondent tonight, and we'll take you right through each of the points here. But first of all, Pierre, for those watching and just tuning in, what do we know tonight about the suspect?
Again, law enforcement officials were initially told that the suspect was identified as Ryan Lanza. There's now some information that it's in fact his brother Adam Lanza. So law enforcement officials say they're trying to get definitive clarity on that. As soon as we know that it's definitively one brother or the other, will get that information out. Again, the information is that the shooter is dead at the scene, as we reported all afternoon. The suspect's mother, we do know that, who was an employee at the school, was also among those killed along with those children. And the law enforcement officials are now trying to sort through the person's background, trying to get some sense of what the motive may have been for this tragic shooting.
So the question at this hour is which of these 2 names has been attached to the suspect by authorities. There's some question of whether it's Adam Lanza or Ryan Lanza. They're both brothers. And as they sort through that, Pierre, the relationship with the woman targeted, the teacher targeted in the school, would be the same regardless of which name is actually finally settled upon by authorities. That this was their mother, correct?
That is correct. And as one source said, look, you have a dead suspect at the scene. Again, the initial information provided by the local authorities, the federal officials have been working off that information, but they're now becoming increasingly certain that it's probably going to be Adam Lanza, but again, we'll know more shortly.
But this would be a son going into a school where his mother was a teacher, and it would appear targeting her kindergarten class.
Well, that is the information that the people who were at the school became a part of whatever the target was at the school. Again, the early thought is that the mother likely was the initial target.
It's extraordinary, actually, to wrap your head around the numbers, Pierre, as they've unfolded this afternoon. You've covered many of these tragedies for us, particularly these school shootings across the country. But this one, as we just look at the numbers of 18 children, 2 additional children at the hospitals, this will go down as the deadliest school shooting at an elementary school in this country.
Awful situation. As a father of a 10-year-old, I often go to a school and I ring the buzzer and they let me walk into the school. This is the kind of situation where no parent could even fathom of something like this happening. And again, as we talked to many of the law enforcement officials today who were trying to get the information, trying to assess what was going on, you could hear the sadness in their voices as well, David.
Pierre, thank you so much. You've been working your sources throughout the day here on what's been a very difficult story. If I could, I would love to take our viewers back to that image, the flag above the White House tonight, because this has become a national tragedy. And in times of tragedy, this country does come together. And leading that effort was the president this afternoon, who said before the country that he addresses this, reacts to it initially as a parent, not a president. Flags are now at half staff. And inside that White House tonight, he described a scene that will unfold. He and his wife, Michelle, he said, will hug their daughters when they get home from school, just as every parent across this country. And Jake, he wasn't overtly political, but he did offer a little bit of insight into where he's thinking that this conversation about how to prevent this has got to move forward in some sort of constructive fashion.
That's right, David. Considering how much President Obama has avoided talking or acting for gun control, he originally, when his political career began as a state senator, was very active in gun control, and even somewhat so as a U.S. senator. But as a presidential candidate, he has not talked much about it. Certainly as a president, has not done much about it. He alluded to it today, talking about how we needed to come together as a society to prevent tragedies like this from happening again, no matter what the politics are. That would seem to me, based on covering him for the last 5 or 6 years, to be at least a nod towards gun control, whether it is high-capacity magazine clips or keeping guns out of the hands of people with a history of mental and emotional problems. I can't tell you, but it was at least an allusion to it, which is more than we've heard from him in the past. But beyond the politics of it, David, of course, there was the raw emotion of it. I've covered President Obama, as I said, for more than half a decade. He is not known as a particularly demonstrative or overly histrionic person when it comes to his emotions. He was tearful today in a way that I have not seen him except for a couple times. The death of his grandmother, who helped raise him shortly before the election in 2008, would be one of those times. But he's not somebody who is emotional, but he really had to collect himself a few times during his remarks, not just with wiping tears from his eyes, but taking a moment so as to seemingly to gird himself emotionally to prevent himself from having to break down. He did react, as he said he did, initially as a father, as somebody who is feeling demonstrable grief about what happened today in Newtown, Connecticut. Of course, we all know his daughters, Sasha and Malia, who are now 11 and 14 years old. He said that he and the First Lady tonight would do what so many parents will do across this country, hold their daughters a little bit tighter tonight. And of course, he noted all those families in Connecticut that will not be able to do the same, David.
You know, Jake, we were looking at images as you were describing the president wiping away those tears, along with your description of him there in the briefing room. And you and I just covered this bruising campaign. But one thing that his challenger, Governor Romney, said through the campaign when asked, what do you respect the president for? And he often said his role as a father, that he's a dedicated family man. And that moment of emotion there at the White House today will likely be welcomed by parents across the country, but in particular in that one community, Jake.
Indeed, and in fact, one thing that is not as interesting and not as important, but certainly I took note of, is while the president was speaking, to the side sat his press secretary and one of his deputy chiefs of staff, as is normal. But in this instance, they were holding hands and wiping away tears themselves. This is the kind of thing, because the president, whomever he is the commander-in-chief, the caretaker of the nation, responsible for keeping people in this country safe. That is the number one responsibility of the president. Events like this, although they can't be compared to how hard it's hitting people in Newtown, Connecticut, they do hit rather hard here because people here feel responsible for the well-being of the American people, especially children. And so it is very sad here today, David.
All right, our senior White House correspondent, Jake Tapper, there at the White House, where he's been all day following the president and his briefings. Jake, thank you. We'll talk to you again soon. And in the meantime, I want to bring in my friend Chris Cuomo, anchor of 2020, who's out in Shady Brook, Connecticut, the community surrounding that school. And Chris, you said you were inside one of these homes as this played out today, the uncertainty and then finding out the answers. And I'm curious, do you know anything more about the text messages that went out, that immediate alert that sent a sort of shockwave through this entire community, as parents didn't know at first really which school, but certainly didn't know whether or not they would find their children when they got to that firehouse?
That's exactly right, David. The first word that these parents heard was lockdown. And imagine that you got a kid in a K through 4 and you're hearing the words lockdown. And then the phone tree starts, and that it's a shooter, and that there are injuries. And then everybody in this small community rushes to this place. The place has been choked with traffic all day, and they couldn't get within a quarter mile of the school. So then they run up to the school. Police are hectic and harried at the same time. There's rumor of a second shooter. They're canvassing the area, and these parents are desperate for their kids. They wind up coming to a firehouse. They're holding up signs. They're desperately searching around. All these kids all look the same within that age range, and over time they start connecting with a face. They see a teacher's aide. They see a teacher. They see their own kid. And lives go from the darkest of moments into the most guilty of feeling good in the situation because you have your kid. And I sat with these mothers and fathers today who didn't know where their kid was, and they didn't know which way it was going to go, and they were with other parents who lost their kids today. And then they wound up having theirs come home, and they're coming together in their homes, they're coming together in each other's arms in what is unfixable in terms of the pain and the senselessness. We've heard it all before, but for these families, it's all new, and they're all trying to handle what to tell their kids. It's one of the complicating factors of this story for the victims and even for everyone involved. What do you tell the kids who are at the center of it, who are too young to understand what happened, and you don't want them to know these types of things? That's how young those kids were, David, and that's what the families are struggling with tonight.
And Chris, you know the calendar. It's December 14th. The countdown is on to Christmas, and you're a dad yourself. You know they have an internal clock. They wake up every morning knowing how many days until Santa comes.
You know, for these parents, I watched them. You watch them, you know, they shatter a little bit, listening to their little girl. She's got no teeth in the front of her mouth, and she's talking about an American Girl doll. And that's what was on her mind this morning, and it should have been on her mind this morning. And the next thing she hears are loud bangs. We know what they were. She didn't. And the teacher keeping their poise in the worst of moments. And she could keep focused on Christmas. She's told to close her eyes tightly, and she does because she's so young. So she doesn't even know what she moves past, what's inside that school right now, which families are never going to recover from. And this being at Christmas is a mixed situation because at once it makes it so much worse because you're so close to something that was going to make people happy, and yet there are more families here than not who got Christmas early today. The numbers are staggering. No one can take it away. We don't even know how many kids are left inside that school yet. But these families, a lot of them got Christmas early, David, because they have a gift that for moments today they did not know that they were going to have, and that is the worst pain for a parent.
You're absolutely right, Chris. And for those children, Santa will be playing an even more outsized role this year as sort of an escape from what it is they've just survived. And I want to check back in with Pierre Thomas because obviously he's been trying to sort through this developing investigation. There had been some question about which of the two sons might have been involved in targeting their mother, according to authorities. And Pierre, are we any closer?
Yes, we have at least two sources now who've gone back and double-checked the information. The initial information was provided was Ryan Lanza. They're now saying they're pretty much certain that it's going to turn out to be Adam Lanza, who is 20 years old, the younger brother, who they believe to be the person who went into the school and did the shooting.
And there's some reporting, Pierre, that the other brother is being questioned at this point. What can you add to that?
I don't have any clarity on that yet, but any person who's associated with the believed shooter is a person that will be talked to by law enforcement.
And of course, the big question at this hour, among many, is this second scene in Newtown, Connecticut, Pierre, and is there any more guidance on what they're searching for and who the person is who's deceased at that location?
Again, all we know so far is it's another person who's dead, somehow associated with the young man who is believed to have done the shooting. Again, no direct confirmation on exactly who that is yet.
All right, Pierre, we'll check back in with you shortly. I want to check in with your colleague, Jim Avila, who is up from Washington and in the region covering the story. And Jim has been looking into the family dynamic, too. And I know so little is known at this point, but Jim, can you shed any light on the family that we're talking about here, the Lanza family, the mother who is the kindergarten teacher, and, of course, us trying to figure out which of the children investigators are zeroing in on?
Well, David, just following up on what Pierre has just reported, if indeed the shooter turns out to be Adam, I just spoke with a local realtor here named Barbara Fry, who is a neighbor of that family. Her son went to school at the Sandy Hook Elementary School with Adam. She described to me that Adam, in fact, was a bit of a troubled child, that she describes the mother as saying he had Asperger's and that he also suffered from OCD. She quotes the mother as saying that. She also says that the mother, that she knew the mother briefly, and that the mother was a dignified woman, is what she said, but that she was a very strict parent, and that sometimes her son Adam would rebel at that as her children grew up with Adam. So that's sort of the beginning of the portrait of a family we're getting from here. That if it is indeed Adam, that he may have had some kind of trouble, some kind of learning disability, OCD or Asperger's of some kind. That's what we're getting from people here. We're also been reporting on the school itself, David, and I'll just tell you that this is a very special school, and I mean that in the terms of honored and an honored school, a school where people in fact moved to Newtown so they could go have their children go to this school. In fact, parents often had longer commutes, but they wanted to live here because the school was so good and the teachers had such a great reputation.
And Jim, we reported this earlier. Stick with us here, because this school seemed to be doing everything right when it comes to protecting your children. When you travel to these schools across the country to do stories, or if you're a parent or an uncle and you're going to pick up the children from school, often there are these procedures in place, not metal detectors, although there are some of those at schools in this country, but more often is the case that you'd walk in, there's some sort of camera involved and a sign-in desk in the office, and that's exactly what they had done just this year, is to add some sort of visual monitoring system. You get through that, you have to go to the office, you have to show ID, and they even sent out a letter saying it might be a bit of a hassle, but please understand us that we have to do this in asking for ID, and certainly we now know how important that is. But as you point out, this would seem to be a school that was trying to do just about everything it could for the well-being, the welfare of its little children.
Yes, and I just spoke with a former student who's now in college who went to Sandy Hook, and she said that when she was in elementary school there, they even had drills back then, and that the parents, the teachers would tell the children that we're having a drill now, and they would have to go to the corners of the classroom, and they would have to be quiet and wait for further instruction. And they were told in advance how to handle this. And that, in fact, this young student told me that when she heard today about these stories of these little kids running into closets and hiding in closets and hiding from a gunman, that in fact it gets chills up her spine, because she remembered those drills and what these kids were going through.
Yeah.
So it is a very difficult time for everybody in this community. Because Sandy Hook Elementary School is sort of the jewel of this community, and something that a school that had a reputation for something totally different.
Yeah, well, let's just say it's still a jewel tonight, because, Jim, as you know, on this end of reporting the story, we've been watching the images of these dedicated teachers, extraordinary bravery as they took those children out of the school today. You can see some of the clergy, this nun here in this image, arriving at the scene. And as we continue to look at images just coming into us now, I want to bring Jen Ashton, a doctor with our medical team, in on the conversation. And you were nodding your head as Jim talked about really a way of life in schools in America right now, these drills that students go through, even at the very youngest of ages, which might explain why they were so calm and followed everything right down to a T in getting out of that school today.
Yeah, I think that this is a reality of the times in which we live, David. My own children have lockdown drills regularly at their school, and they explain them and describe them to me in explicit detail. You know, they are told that they have 60 seconds to get into the closest building. The teachers lock the doors. They are then instructed to go into classrooms where they are told to get under desks in the corner of the room. The shades are pulled. The classroom doors are locked. I mean, these things are really routine now in many, many schools. So I think that even at these young ages in elementary schools, yes, these drills were practiced as any disaster drill is practiced. Unfortunately, you never want to need to use those skills, but they are unfortunately routine now in many, many schools, my children's included.
But they were employed today, and I want to keep with these pictures here now if we could. But Jen, I was struck by the children inside that first grade classroom, the teacher who said she had them hiding in the bathroom in the classroom, and one of their first instincts, and these are first graders, was to ask, how are the other kids out there? Is there anyone else out there that we can get into the bathroom?
When you see a disaster like this, David, you see reflex behavior instinctive behavior and reaction become
But at
automatic.
6 years old,
Instincts and reactions of those 6-year-olds, instincts and reactions of any adult there. If you have ever been around a child, whether you're a parent or not, you know that your instinctive human reaction is to protect that child. That's what these teachers did, and the children, yes, they're brave, yes, they're selfless, but their instincts kick in, and we see that across the board with this type of tragedy here.
We're looking at pictures now, another parent or perhaps grandparents picking up their children today. The ambulances that arrived with their lights going, and then, as Dan Harris reported earlier, parked there, the lights turning off. And that was one of the things I heard from one doctor today who said what they were expecting was to deal with an influx of patients who've been carried in from the hospital. Instead, what they got was a situation very much like what we saw in 9/11, was that emergency rooms were ready and no one came.
Right, let me take you inside the hospital, David, to these close hospitals, these trauma centers, to what they would have been doing in preparation for this type of mass casualty trauma situation. They immediately stop all elective surgery. They will clear out the trauma bays in the emergency room. They notify the blood bank. They make sure they have massive ready amounts of blood transfusions available for the incoming patients. And they designate sometimes between 10 and 20 medical personnel per patient. And unfortunately at this time, they got very, very few, unfortunately, that were around. But, this type of disaster drill, trauma drill, routine at any level 1 trauma center.
We want to bring in Brad Garrett, who's an FBI profiler, formerly with the FBI, and works with us here at ABC News. And Brad, as we look at this and we try to learn more about which of these two brothers it was, what doesn't change is the relationship, that this was son and this was mother. She was a kindergarten teacher, and for some reason, the suspect appeared at her doorway today, and that's going to be a huge part of this as we move forward.
I think one of the more interesting reportings is that if we have the right son, he had some learning disabilities. So you're talking about a child, excluding what happened today, growing up more frustrated, many times feeling more alienated because they have difficulties developing relationships. And so to go back to what we briefly talked about earlier, this sort of goes up and it escalates as they get older, they get more angry. And so as a result, I think that he just couldn't take it anymore, and that he wanted to empower himself. And unfortunately, he chose a horrible way to do it.
I mean, it would almost sound, some are talking about this notion of some sort of a suicide mission. If you have a suspect, we clearly don't know whether or not he took his own life, but if that's the case, in going to 2 different locations, the mother now dead, the teacher, and 18 children in that school in 2 separate rooms, many of the children in her own classroom, and then the 2 children who died at the hospital later. This is someone who looked into that classroom and saw 5-year-olds sitting there and was still able to capable of pulling this off, which is just impossible to comprehend.
But they weren't 5-year-olds to him. They were just objects. They were something that were connected to his mother. You have to wipe away any empathy, any belief or feeling that he has about anyone else except himself. This is all about me. These mass shooters could care less about the rest of us, that they are going to get they're going to seek revenge. And if the person that wronged them is touching other people, they're going to get rid of them. And so if it ends up being that the shooter, Mr. Alonzo, shot himself, that doesn't surprise me, and I tell you why. Then he's actually controlling the ultimate end to his life. That he took his life before he allowed law enforcement to take it. So like, you're not going to talk to me, I'm going to take this with me. And so we have seen that across the board in these shootings.
Brad, stay with us here. You've been so helpful throughout the day. It's still hard for anyone to accept that someone couldn't have empathy for children sitting in a school classroom, but that's the mental health component of this and why we need to report that in the coming days too, so we can try to see these warning signs before something like this can develop. But we've learned that there's going to be a prayer vigil at the Newtown United Methodist Church. That's this evening, we believe. They've secured a location there for people to come and pray together. This is going to be a community that, as Jim Avila pointed out, had long come together. This was a school that prided itself on its awards and what it was able to do for its children educationally. We've learned about the additional strategies for keeping their children safe, employed just this year. And tonight, it's now a community that will hug like the hug you saw there just now on the screen and come together at this vigil. The investigation, and the producers will let me know when I have Pierre Thomas back on the line, continues tonight. And for those of you joining us looking for your local news a short time from now in much of this country, we wanted to bring you up to speed. There are two locations tonight where investigators are, the school and the second location. Is that not correct, Pierre?
That is correct. And again, we are getting additional confirmation that Adam Lanza, age 20, is thought to be the shooter. As we just reported a few moments ago, law enforcement officials are now dissecting his life, trying to figure out what the motive may have been. They believe that he went to the school in part. The early theory is to kill his mother, who worked at the school. Law enforcement officials we're also being told by a number of sources, speaking with and interviewing his brother Ryan, who's age 24.
Do we have any idea, Pierre, about what he had on his person? He's been described as wearing a vest, carrying 4 weapons, as I believe you reported earlier today. And there was one mother who told us earlier in our reporting and talking with Diane, saying there was word of a mask. But you would know better than any of us. Can you describe what we know he had on him when he entered that school? What we know officially is that we are told that at least 2 handguns were recovered near the shooter's body, that they also found shell casings which appear to be from a .223 assault-style rifle. We don't have confirmation on it yet as to whether that rifle has been recovered. So law enforcement, again, is meticulously going through that crime scene, trying to gather all the evidence that they can, as well as trying to reconstruct this man's final few days. And in the fog of these investigations, these are the kind of questions that get cleared up with time, but there was some initial reporting that perhaps one of them lived in New Jersey, one of the sons, but it would seem that the family lived in Newtown. Is that correct? Well, David, in these situations, having covered them a number of times, there's so much information that police are trying to get. Some of the eyewitnesses tend to have wrong information. They get initial information from the crime scene, from the person's body sometimes, and that information is sometimes confusing. So again, right now they're simply trying to assess the damage. They now know the number of dead. They've removed all the people from the scene who were injured. And now the difficult work of why did this happen is beginning to take place. And Pierre, do we have any update on the timeline for the parents who are still waiting for confirmation? Hours have gone by and many know the inevitable, but do we know how this will play out, the most difficult part of this day? Well, we know the governor, as you reported earlier, spoke to some of the parents. Again, we don't know the specific details about what was said about each child, which is the most difficult part. Pierre, thank you so much. Your hard work in our Washington Bureau today. And so here's what we know. Reporting in just now, Pierre Thomas, the suspect is believed at this hour to be Adam Lanza. He is 20 years old. One of the victims, his mother, a kindergarten teacher, and many of the children inside her classroom. In fact, we don't know if any of the children survived in that kindergarten class. And so the numbers are as follows. 18 children in the school. 2 children had been shot. They rushed them to the hospital. That was the Danbury Hospital, where they had set up a triage, and the 2 children did not survive there. So 20 children in all, 6 adults. We believe that some of those adults were in fact teachers, obviously the kindergarten teacher, the mother. And what's not known at this hour is that second location in Newtown, Connecticut, the additional adult that's also deceased. We don't know the relationship between them, but we do know that the suspect again at this hour is Adam Landa, 20 years old, and that it's his brother Ryan who might be at this hour being questioned. That's what we do not know at this point. We certainly do not know who that other person is in that house we talked to. One of the things we did talk about here with the medical team is the reaction from the children inside that school, how calm they were, how terrified they were, but how calm they were in getting out of that school. And then the reaction from some of their older siblings that were at the middle school, at the high school, and so worried about whether or not their younger siblings had survived. And there was a 17-year-old earlier today. He talked with our affiliate WTNH, and it was a moment that I thought was quite powerful about the worry one sibling has for another, particularly when you're a teenager and you know the breadth of what's going on. Take a look.
What did your sister tell you? I saw her with you earlier, and she won't even look anywhere near the camera. She seems pretty horrified. Was she able to explain to you what she witnessed?
Well, I mean, she's very traumatized. When she walked out of the school, she was crying. All the students were holding hands. The teachers were traumatized. But, you know, based on what she said was at about, like, early in the morning, she heard, like, the intercom came on to the school, and she heard a scream, and she heard a gunshot, or two gunshots, and then the school went into lockdown. And when they hid in the closet, she was in art class, and they had to hide in the closet, and they were quiet. And the children obviously were very shaken. They were crying in the closet, in the closet of the art room. And eventually, you know, they were leaving, and when they were leaving, the police made them hold hands, and the police told them to close their eyes.
The 17-year-old who talked about his reaction when he found out his younger sister in the 4th grade, his little sister, was okay. We want to take you back to images that are just coming in now as the scene continues to unfold. And as we look at them, I wanted to bring in Jen Ashton from our medical team. And when you talk about a 17-year-old boy, this is a teenager. And we know what younger siblings are like and the makeup of a household. But boy, do you see the true colors of a love between two siblings when something like this happens, and how worried and devastated he was at just the notion, the thought that he might not see her.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of that has to do with what we know as we get older. We can theorize or guess and imagine what that 5-year-old or 6-year-old or 7-year-old has just seen, heard, felt. And that in and of itself is mind-boggling for an adult or a late adolescent. When you talk about those children, we have to remember developmentally, they are at a stage right now where they're very vulnerable.
Thank you, Jen. We want to go back to Connecticut now.
I've told you the number of deceased in the building, at the hospital, and at the secondary crime scene. It's our policy and protocol that we have to establish positive identification of those victims. That is a time-consuming process. That's something that's going to take a great deal of time. The medical examiner has already arrived on the scene. He's going to work very closely with us to expedite that and get that done as efficiently as possible. As I told you, the families have been assigned a trooper or an officer as a line of communication. That was done specifically to ensure the families that they have constant communication with this ongoing investigation, and they won't have to sit and watch television news or anything else. They will be the first to know any of the progress that's made as this investigation continues on. As I stated earlier, the assets that were utilized initially was certainly when the call came in, Newtown Police Department immediately responded and immediately called for help. Surrounding local agencies sent officers, and the Connecticut State Police sent all off-duty and on-duty troopers to respond so that they could immediately gain access to that building and begin that search process that I alluded to before. We had the State Police Tactical Team. We had K-9 teams out here. We certainly had Trooper 1 in the air, and it was probably to keep some of your helicopters away, quite frankly. But we had every possible asset came out to this scene the minute that this alarm came in, or this call came in, and it was certainly to do everything we could to protect certainly life and property. The community has been outstanding in supporting this effort. As you can see, you've taken over their park, and they're showing up. They're offering condolences. They're doing everything they possibly can to support the victims, the victims' families of this horrific tragedies. The FBI crisis management team is offered to respond, is going to respond here tomorrow to assist in crisis management, to assist not only with the families and the family members, but with all the first responders, the police, fire, EMS, all working at what I described before as a very horrific and difficult scene. Certainly local mental health crisis intervention teams have been on scene and have been here all of the day working and assisting and helping. I just want to make it very clear that there were 18 children who were pronounced dead at the scene. There were 2 children who were transported to area hospital or pronounced dead at the hospital. There were 6 adults that were pronounced dead at the scene. And obviously the shooter was also pronounced dead at the scene. I don't have much more detail about that secondary scene, but there is a related scene that we discovered as we were continuing the criminal investigation, and specifically investigating the shooter. And you probably saw, and someone asked me on the way in here about the bomb squad. And yes, we brought all our assets in case they were needed. And when we went out with Newtown officers to search or to execute search warrants or to examine other possible secondary scenes, we took all those assets with us to ensure that they were right there immediately so that we could react if it was necessary. That's about all I have as far as details are concerned. I want to give you one more briefing, probably just before 6 o'clock. We'll try to get back up here for one more briefing. I'll take a couple brief questions, but I must again tell you that there are certain things we cannot discuss at this time. I will take you right here, sir.
Do we have anyone who's in the hospital now that survived this?
No, sir. There was one person that was injured that suffered an injury and did survive, yes.
Did you confirm the body in the house was a male?
I'm sorry, I can't confirm. I know about the secondary scene. I didn't have time to get into detail about that. I'll try to do that for 6 o'clock.
What shooter's identity? Adam Lanza, can you confirm?
I'm not going to confirm the identity of the shooter. We're not prepared to do that yet. So we have a tentative identification. We're still working with that. So we're not going to confirm the identity and put that out there. We will identify the shooter at an appropriate time. Just for our investigatory purposes, it's not appropriate to do that right now. Yes.
What do you say is happening in Hoboken, New Jersey, in terms of investigation there?
Again, it's part and parcel of what we do. I told you initially that we will leave no stone unturned as we're looking at every facet of this investigation. Whether it's the shooter, any of the victims, we're going to look at everything. And we certainly will go in and out of state, and we'll work with fellow law enforcement, including federal agencies if we need to answer every single question to exactly what transpired here. And it'll be a time-consuming process, but we'll get it done.
Where are the families now?
Right now, one shooter, yes, sir. It was K through 4, kindergarten through 4th grade. That's the school. They were all students of that school, sir. I don't know the grade they were in. I'm sorry, I don't know that. One section, 2 classrooms. I couldn't tell you. I don't know. I didn't find that out. I'm sorry.
Where are the families?
Your question? No, everyone's been, and that's part of the process, and that's why it took us long to get here. That's a very good question. Are there any students that were unaccounted for? We had to ensure that we accounted for every single student in that school, and that includes maybe someone that was absent for the day because of illness and didn't come to school. So that was part of the process that we had to go through, and now we have the identification process, which is even more difficult, and so it's going to be some time before we're able to give you that information. It probably won't be available until sometime tomorrow.
Did you identify the weapon?
Did we identify a weapon? We have seized the weapons. Yes, we have, sir.
What kind of weapon?
We did not. We will not discuss that at this time, sir.
Still trying to reach parents at this time.
We've been in contact with all the parents. We would not come up here until we've been in contact with all the parents, and we've been communicating with them since they arrived here at the scene. They've been fully informed, and that's why it took so long for us to come up here. Go ahead.
What about them? What is planned?
That's it's a good question. Everyone believes that it's something that first responders do, that law enforcement does. But I can tell you, we provided counseling for the first responders because this was a very tragic, horrific scene that they encountered. It's not something that we want to see. It's not something that we see every day. So that's one thing that we have done, and the Colonel has made that perfectly clear that those people are to be spoken to and receive crisis counseling as required.
Lieutenant, you probably you have to be the face here
The lieutenant can certainly tell you he's a Newtown officer.
As authorities and
Sure.
as a person, to see this tragedy of this magnitude, how could you describe it has impacted you personally, not only as a law enforcement officer, but as a person?
As a person, the first thing I thought about was my own children.
Talk right here. Go ahead.
Can you say your name, please?
Lieutenant George Cinco.
What's your name?
Lieutenant George Cinco, S-I-N-K-O.
Can you tell us as a resident of Newtown and also as a law enforcement, can I ask you one more question?
Yes.
This is most definitely the worst thing that we've had experience here in town. Tragic. But right now, we're concerned about the families of the victims. Our officers are professional, and we will deal with this as well.
Can you describe the scene with the parents? Is there a place where people are getting together and are there counselors there for them? What's happening? What's that scene like?
The local hospital, Danbury Hospital, has offered their crisis intervention counselors. They will be available at Reed Intermediate School, which is on Wasserman Way, and they're available right now if need be, and they will be there all weekend.
Is there a place where parents are gathering? I mean, and what's that? Can you describe that?
The parents certainly have gathered at the local firehouse, which is adjacent to the school, and we've done our best to comfort them and try to reassure them that we've done everything we can. But as mentioned, it's a difficult process to confirm the status of an entire elementary school, and we need to be right when we do that.
Yeah, we'll be working. State Police Major Francois will be out there later tonight.
It's healing. We just have to think about the families right now and do everything we can for them.
Lieutenant, was one of the teachers killed to the
We can't confirm any of that right now. The investigation is ongoing. There are still parents there, yes. I don't have a number for you. I don't have a number for you.
Then we're going to jump to answer all the questions.
When did you realize you guys, what was connected? How long did it take you to realize you guys?
We have minutes after our officers were there, they realized, what a horrific scene we had there.
Well, there are specific place, and we're certainly working with them. So they're free to go. Change of clothes, we'll work with them. We'll make it a school.
I don't have the exact timeline on that. Certainly our officers responded immediately, and as soon as they realized what they had, we obviously asked for all the resources we could get. All right? Thank you. Anything, Paul?
Yeah, I think we're good. Let me just finish this.
That is the team there in Connecticut. Lieutenant Paul Vance of the Connecticut State Police. They're going to brief again in another hour from now, as is often the case after these tragedies. They now have the tough task of coming before the camera every so often. What we learned in that briefing just moments ago was that all of the parents have now been contacted, all have been informed. 20 children died today, 18 inside that school, including that kindergarten teacher and many of the children in her classroom. There were 6 adults, and there's another adult at a separate location in Newtown, Connecticut, and we'll have much more on that as the evening progresses. We'll have continuing coverage on this, a special 1-hour edition of World News with Diane Sawyer. In fact, Diane is there on the scene where she's been reporting all afternoon. A special 2020 followed by Nightline tonight and Good Morning America first thing in the morning. I'm David Muir. I thank you for being with us all afternoon. And as we leave you with the images of this very trying afternoon in America, we must remember there are 20 sets of parents out there whose little children did not come home today. We'll see you shortly on World News.
This has been a special report from ABC News. This has been a News Channel 15 special report.